撳睇唔到嚟㗎，你開咗先。
No idea how it works. Okay, got it. Okay. Good afternoon, all. I hope lunch was fine and you're not in a terrible food coma. But I can assure you the next 3 papers are by, just very eminent speakers of their topics, and we just can't wait to hear them. So before that, I just wanted to make a little introduction about this second panel discussion on spatial and formal practices, which also happens to be the only panel that was in this symposium that is a sequel to a panel at the GSD symposium in October. So in many ways, the all-encompassing topic of spatial and formal practices could easily represent all of the papers presented on PEI's work. But as organizers, we remember having to debate why we need this title called Spatial and Formal Practices, because in one way, it's kind of in response to PEI's very evident mastery of architecture, of fundamental elements of spatial and formal elements, but that some could actually somehow celebrate, but at the same time also call to investigate, but also critique. But on the other hand, it's also an attempt to consider PEI's visibly spatial and formal practice in perhaps more invisible ways, implicit ways that render his practice as more than just the architect-auteur practice, but a practice enmeshed in the multiple agencies that constitute architectural production. So at the GSD, I think this is that a copy? Let's see. Okay, so at the GSD, the papers presented in this panel of the same title consisted of more formal analyses of the Everson Museum and the Des Moines Art Center as containers of art that are really characterized by this word that was used called tempered brutalism, that reinforce PEI's disposition as a master civic and cultural architect, but also to do with his an inquiry about PEI's space-time conception that is rooted on the spatiality of the Chinese garden through projects like Fragrant Hill. But another set of papers in that panel were those that studied the reception and the use of PEI's Master Lab of the National Center of Atmospheric Research that surpassed the architect's intended functions, but also a provocation on the validity of considering PEI's minor work, quote-unquote minor work, in the form of Boston Government Center that was a product of a very haphazard relay of multiple actors or authors. So this afternoon, we are pleased to continue our attempt in diversifying the ways that we reappraise PEI's practice through the lens of rather overlooked and sometimes even underrepresented aspects of his formal and spatial practice. And these include Barry Bergdahl's paper on contextualizing PEI's master thesis project at Harvard GSD on the Museum for Chinese Art for Shanghai of 1946 by situating it in the complex trans-Pacific debate on the changing role of the art museum in both China, Shanghai, but also in the States. And the second paper will be Eric Mumford's addressing of PEI's urban design projects that developed as part of Web and NAP from 1948 to 1960 in the intellectual contexts and knowledge networks of a more humanistic urban design. And Sang-Kwan's paper, last but not least, will be on PEI's persistence and consistency in the deployment of sculpture and what it would say about PEI's ideal conception of public space and the role that art would play in it. And also how such deployments could reinforce his connoissorial aptitude, at the same time also his strategic use of art to modulate his supposedly sometimes necessarily utilitarian spaces. So like all the other papers presented in these two symposiums, we hope that the complexities and problematics they raise would really kind of cause us to consider Pei's prolific and diverse projects, that he continues to be an architect that is not easily pigeonholed, and that would require us to look at him beyond the formalistic avant-garde framework, but a cross-disciplinary approach of assessing architecture as a process of entanglements than just the built outcome. Thank you. So I'll introduce Barry. Okay, this is the, where is this? Yes, Barry. Your very prolific bio here. So Barry Bergdahl is the Mayer Shapiro Professor of Art History and Archaeology at the Department of Art History, Columbia University, and the Museum of Modern Art, New York. And Barry is research interests have centered on modern architectural history with a particular emphasis on France and Germany since 1750. He has studied questions of the politics of cultural representation in architecture, then the larger ideological content of 19th century architectural theory, as well as the changing role of both architecture as a profession and architecture as a cultural product in 19th century European society. So he was also served as Philip Johnson Chief Curator at the Museum of Modern Art from 2007 to 2013, where he offered a series of exhibitions intended to offer more inclusive visions of subjects, including Mies van der Rohe, the Bauhaus, Henri Labouste, Le Corbusier, Latin American post-war architecture, and most recently, Frank Lloyd Wright. Barry, please. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just in the background a minute ago. Yeah. That one. Perfect. And I control it from where? Oh, thank you.
Left, right.
Super. Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to visit a project that keeps popping up over and over again. I was sad not to be at the Harvard occasion, but I watched much of it online, and I realized it came up often there as well. This is, of course, as was just said, Pei's master's thesis project at the GSD. Here recreated in a model in a recent exhibition at Gund Hall. And I want to situate it between two contexts. So I'm going to very much contextualize rather than simply offer a formal reading of this. And I hope in the end analysis what my contribution will be is to situate this project in its own time in the 1940s rather than to be fascinated by it as some kind of DNA for the museums that were to come, in fact, somewhat later. In fact, in many ways, it's quite different from the Everson Museum, and I think we should discuss that later on. I.M. Pei concluded a stellar progress through Harvard's GSD with a project that at once set him as a rising star in a debate over the progress of architecture and on the display of art in a museum setting in China, since at this point he still hoped to return to his native country. A 1946 design for Museum of Chinese Art in Shanghai raised the issue not only of what a museum in an urban setting should look like, and how it should behave as the world began trying to put itself together again after World War II, but also on whether Chinese art required its own type of spatial frame for experience and viewing. Inside a complex two-story frame of widely spaced reinforced concrete piers, featureless, so as to make no overt reference either to Western colonnades nor to Chinese timber traditions, Pei proposed a museum space that was as much a community center as a museum, and equally, as keeps coming up, as much a landscape with its garden flowing through the building and inhabiting interior, what he calls tea pavilions and flower gardens, as it was an enclosed building in any way. So in that way, quite different from the Everson to come. It was a remarkable design which catapulted one of Walter Gropius's prize students onto the world stage when the design was published in two of the leading architectural publications of the day, Progressive Architecture, which you see here on the screen in 1948, and I don't have a slide of it, but 2 years later in a virtual reprint in L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in Paris in 1950, in both of which the museum project, moreover, is specified as not simply a type, but as a specific proposal for Shanghai, and in a certain way is published as the triumph of the emergent Gropius American School. Now, the design can only be understood, I'm going to argue this afternoon, if we reconstruct two key debates. First, the debate over a museum for Shanghai in the 1930s, and we need to jump ahead. We'll come back to this and look at it much more specifically. But there it is in its publication. And this takes us, of course, to Shanghai. First in the debate over a museum for Shanghai in the 1930s, well underway when Pei was a secondary school student there. And then the debate in the second half of my paper on the architecture, function, and civic role of a museum, very much in the forefront in the years Pei trained in the U.S. in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So by the time Pei boarded a ship in August 1935 for the U.S., Shanghai was in the throes of a protracted debate on creating a new civic center. As is well known from the researches of a number of scholars, including, of course, Cole, who's with us right now, this project for the civic center activated interrelated debates. One, of course, was the issue of stylistic expression, as the administration of Chiang Kai-shek began to adopt a modernized Chinese traditional style, which some have called a kind of Ming revival. The issue of tradition versus modernity then was as active in China as it was in many other parts of the world in the 1930s, a debate marked by discussions over the differences between modernism and nationalism, nationalism and regionalism, and so on. Now, for the Shanghai Civic Center, alongside a new city hall, library, gymnasium, and hospital and courthouse, was to be a museum aimed toward meeting a long-standing complaint that the city had no such institution or building. So there's the City Hall as it finally came to be realized. Now, already in the China press, and it's very useful for us non-Chinese speakers that there is such an active English language press in this period, already in the China press for June 13th, 1930, now Pei is only 13, we don't know, he's precocious, but I don't know about his newspaper reading habits, a report notes that, quote, in the whole of the world, there does not exist another city of Shanghai's size without a municipal museum. By the following, and this is a leitmotif, by the following year, plans were announced in the China press for, quote, a new $100,000 four-story structure to, quote, replace the Royal Asiatic Museum. But this was in fact long in coming. In 1934, the same newspaper announced city to get new museum and library. Greater Shanghai busy building addition to Qinghua Civic Center, new addition to be distinctly Chinese. It will be, the newspaper tells us, a two-story reinforced concrete construction, the same features that might be added of Pei's thesis project, two-story reinforced concrete. Now, there are actually two buildings involved here, and I want to get into details on this, but there it is as published and as built, and then, of course, this building as well by Deongdun, best known for the City Hall. Now, by the time the building could be celebrated in the January 8th, 1937 issue, Pei had, of course, sailed for America. The China press of that date reported, City Museum opens on Sunday. $300,000 Civic Center building houses big collection. Having the distinction, they write, of being the first institution of its kind ever to be projected by the city, housed in a building in the China style of architecture, the museum boasts a collection of over 20,000 pieces, including priceless porcelains, ancient bronzes, and valuable masterpieces of China's historical painters. In the U.S. magazine Fortune, it also reported on the new building in its 1935 issue, saying, it seems that East and West have at last met. And the startling architecture of the new City Hall and its adjacent building seems to indicate that they have met in wedlock. Fascinating because, of course, it was a favorite place for wedding portraits, but that's another story. Now, that Pei continued to keep his eyes firmly on the situation at home, even as the war with Japan increasingly made it clear that any return would be delayed, is clear enough in his decision already at MIT, this is discussed at the Harvard conference, to design for his to choose a Chinese theme for his thesis project submitted in 1940. See here the cover sheet of the text that accompanied it, a flexible system of propaganda units for wartime and peacetime China, a type of itinerant cultural center in rural areas to be deployed by the Chinese Ministry of Propaganda. The design pays homage in its tensile structures as well as in its conception of cultural propaganda for uniting a vast rural territory, of course, to Soviet revolutionary architecture of the decade after the 1917 revolution. Also recalled is, of course, as was mentioned this morning, here you see some details of the constructive details, particularly in this scheme of this tensile structure. Also recalled is, of course, Le Corbusier's Pavillon des Temps Nouveaux at the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1937, as was mentioned this morning. Le Corbusier's 1935 trip to the United States had an enormous impact on PEI, who recalled the Swiss architect's visit to Cambridge, Mass. As, quote, the two most important days in my professional life. Not the least is that this project, often cited as a project for a theater, was in fact a project for a flexible space that could be modified radically to serve as a theater, a cinema, an exhibition hall, and of course, for all, a place of public assembly, even in the smallest and most remote villages to which it could be moved. Now, what is most impressive in this thesis was first and foremost, is that the thesis was first and foremost saw architecture, as a means for cultural transformation and community building, with a very strong sense of urgency of the need to contribute towards building a sense of nationalism in a country resisting Japanese invasion. PEI's text combines an intensive discussion of the political and social basis of the work, as well as a full development of a system of lightweight bamboo construction meant to effect an alliance between Chinese tradition and the burgeoning interest in prefabrication. Two aspects are relevant for his choice 6 years later to design a museum for Shanghai at the GSD. One is the fact that the space was going to be modifiable, with equal weight given to exhibitions and to theatrical events. The other is that PEI is convinced that bamboo can be used in a mixed assembly to become a modern structural material with the advantages of local availability and adaptability to unskilled labor. There is a fascinating parallel here with his future teacher, Marcel Breuer's experiments in these years, and these are projects that were developed with GSD students, in these years with plywood engineered to rival concrete. In addition to theatrical presentations and movies, PEI's entire structure could be transformed for exhibitions. This would be achieved by considering the whole as a largely open-plan space with flexible partitions, notably to change lighting between a darkened theater and a light-filled display, and, quote, flexible bamboo partitions installed where needed and when for exhibitions. Now, by the time PEI enrolled, now I want to switch to the American context, which I actually think is the one in which this project really develops. So by the time PEI enrolled at the GSD in December 1942, only to interrupt his studies almost immediately to work for the National Defense Research Committee in Princeton, his young wife Eileen was studying landscape design at Harvard. And the art press was filled with a lively debate on the nature of a museum, given the challenges of modernist art and changing society. Much of this centered, and you're going to think that I'm obsessed with this, but much of this centered on New York's Museum of Modern Art. Not only had founding director Alfred Barr, just recently arrived from teaching at Wellesley, conceived of an entirely different concept of the American Museum, but also of the space of the museum, influenced directly by his experiences in the late 1920s in Germany, notably at the Bauhaus, and in the experimental work in art installation undertaken by who you see here on the screen, undertaken by Alexander Dorner in Hanover before he fled Hitler's Germany in late 1937. Barr was instrumental in finding, this is the famous abstract cabinet in Hanover, Barr was instrumental in finding Dorner a position as a director of the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design, and Dorner became a steady voice for a new concept of American museology. He's going to return in our story, so flag him. His concept of, quote unquote, the living museum soon took on an urgency of imagining a role for a museum as an active part of the community at whatever scale, as cultural figures joined the war effort and began to imagine a post-war community. MoMA opened its new building. You're not seeing it here. You're seeing MoMA's two temporary homes. It's little known, too rarely, I think, pointed out that the International Style Exhibition, in fact, took place here. First home, second home, and then we're going to see this block rebuilt in a moment. MoMA opened its new building in the fall of 1939 on West 53rd Street. It had occasioned a major discussion of the appearance a building devoted to modern art should take, i.e., does modern art require a different viewing environment from traditional art? So it's a very interesting conversation here about whether or not art is universal or temporally and culturally specific. This, of course, was an argument that PEI would soon extend to the question of whether or not Chinese art needed to be viewed differently than received conventions for European and American art. Unlike the grand stairs of the American Beaux-Arts Museum type, a tradition still embodied in those very years in a building then under construction in John Russell Pope's National Gallery of Art in Washington, a neoclassical temple opened 2 years after MoMA opened its doors and after MoMA had polemically discarded the conventions of monumental columns in favor of a translucent facade and a revolving door entry. Instead of an ascent to an enclosed interior, there's Russell Pope under construction. So you can see that a lot of things are premonitory for what's to come for PEI. There we go. Instead of an ascent to a closed interior, at MoMA the ground floor was glazed, allowing a view from 53rd Street through the galleries to the sculpture garden behind. Inside MoMA's building was a grid of columns with no fixed partitions. Transparency and flexibility were to become the hallmarks of a new generation of museums at mid-century. The idea of the museum as a community center and as a living institution were also the key words for the debate. And the debate was one put very much on the national stage. There's the floor plan of this open plan museum, simple box. This text, I don't expect you to read it, but just to show that we're here seeing the transcript of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's radio broadcast speech on the opening of MoMA, and he said as much, quote, this is Roosevelt or his ghostwriter, "The Museum of Modern Art is a living museum, not a collection of curios and interesting objects. It can therefore become an integral part of our democratic institutions. It can be woven into the very warp and woof of democracy." But even as MoMA opened its building, it sought to affect the national debate on museum architecture by means of a traveling exhibition. The aim was to counter the press coverage of the neoclassical National Gallery. I'm deliberately picking a recent photograph for you PEI aficionados. But anyway, they want to counter the press around the opening of Pope's building by participating in a competition for a new building for the Smithsonian Institution on a site directly across the mall. MoMA not only took an active role in organizing and judging the competition, but also in publicizing the results. As curator John McAndrew explained, the sterile, classicistic facades of the quote-unquote New Washington are perhaps impressive in their own dreary way, but they are not representative of the best architecture our country can produce. A nationwide competition judged by a progressive and distinguished jury is perhaps a more effective and, in the end, more democratic way of securing a fine design. Now, the connections between MoMA and Harvard, particularly in architectural matters, were therefore reinforced, we'll see in a moment, by this competition. Alfred Barr, Henry Russell Hitchcock, and Philip Johnson, the key actors in MoMA's 1932 so-called International Style Show, had all met at Harvard and had been formed in art history there. Once Walter Gropius arrived to head up the architecture at the newly restyled Graduate School of Design in February 1937, we should think of that as a much publicized arrival that grabbed headlines during PEI's first semesters at MIT. Work also began immediately on what you see here on the screen, a great Bauhaus show in New York, designed by Herbert Bayer as a demonstration piece in innovative exhibition design, breaking from all conventions. I don't have time to really go into its extraordinary techniques of display, much debated and very influential. Let's turn to the Smithsonian competition, organized in large part by MoMA. The Smithsonian competition was organized in 2 stages, an open stage and a final stage among 10 finalists. It was more an idea competition since there was no promise of an immediate building and no funding. Gropius was on the jury, and Joseph Hudnut, who had brought Gropius to Harvard, served as professional advisor, while Thomas Dabney Marby of MoMA was the technical advisor, so again, the kind of Cambridge 53rd Street axis, if you will. Notes were provided by Clarence Stein, an architect member of the American Association of Museums. He had drawn up reports on all aspects of museums, including lighting, and it had published an important paper on the Art Museum of Tomorrow in 1932. In the second round, the first prize went to the project you see here on the screen in model, Eliel and Eero Saarinen, who proposed an open plan of different volumes combining auditoria and galleries, all approached through an open portico with reflecting pool and gardens, literally extending the landscape of the National Mall into the building itself. So as I'm showing you these photographs, I think it's interesting to think of these as floating around by the time PEI is going to do a museum of Chinese art. For indeed, these were prominent features that would find echoes both in the program and in the relationship between landscape and architecture in PEI's thesis project. The display of the projects opened not at MoMA, but in the fall of 1939 at the Baltimore Museum of Art, since that city was contemplating a major building extension to their museum, and moreover, it was closer to Washington and the hopes of influencing federal opinion. Now that's beyond repair. Anyway, but that's editorial. For New York, Saarinen provided this model, was added to the MoMA exhibition, a new model with an openable roof, contained also in the show as it began its travels, notably to Harvard, where it was displayed in April 1940. So PEI would have seen it, because these were precisely the weeks in which he was doing the final renderings for his MIT Propaganda Theater and Exhibition Hall. So here are some views of that model with its auditorium wing and its garden and its relationship to the mall, versions with the tower in the back, and there, these are from the MoMA exhibition files from that traveling exhibition. So very interesting, I think, to put into juxtaposition, as we now will, with the emergence of a larger debate and then the situation of I.M. PEI's thesis project in it. In October 1942 in New York, Peggy Guggenheim opened what you see here on the screen, her gallery, Art of This Century, on West 57th Street. Designed by Friedrich Kiesler, it was still being hotly debated 4 years later when MoMA design curator Edgar Kaufman Jr. published a review of new gallery spaces in America under the title, The Violent Art of Hanging Pictures. The following year, two radically new and radically opposed visions of a future art museum were offered in a contrast even more striking than that engineered between Pope's National Gallery and Saarinen's Smithsonian design, namely that between the two titans of contemporary architecture outside of Boston, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe. Wright, also with a removable roof. Wright, fresh off his huge retrospective in MoMA's new building, was commissioned in 1943 by Hilla Reve, Solomon Guggenheim's art advisor and director of his Museum of Non-Objective Art, then down the street on West 54th Street, to design a prominent building. By the end of the year, Wright had drawn up a variety of schemes for the future Guggenheim Museum's famous spiraling ramp, suspended above an open floor penetrable from the sidewalk by both pedestrians and vehicles. So it was meant, therefore, to bring Central Park right into the space of the museum. So I think that's very well known. But I think to see this early model and realize the extent to which the landscape of Central Park was to be extended right under the museum is quite important, as you see there. And then this way of exhibiting paintings so they could be seen directly, but also from various sides. Now, this museum building as spiral, few, of course, knew that Le Corbusier had worked on a similar concept since 1929, although it is likely that given PEI's enthusiasm for Le Corbusier, he knew the project for a musée à croissance illimitée, which had been published in 1937 in the first volume of the Swiss architect's Œuvre complète. Now, Architectural Forum, to give to the other context for this, did not turn to Wright for museum design when they decided in spring 1943 to devote a special issue to the task of imagining the architectural and urban future of an America once the hostilities of World War II were behind the country. Together with the parent magazine Fortune, they set out to design all aspects of a medium post-war city, choosing, ironically enough for us, Syracuse, New York, imagined as if it had been bombed. Fortune modeled the economic and social dimensions of the city, Forum its architecture and urban layout. So even though famously it is Mies who designs the museum, of course it is the museum finally for Syracuse that will ultimately be designed by PEI, including a civic center where City Hall and museum would be brought into a taut composition at the core, something not without echoes of the Greater Shanghai plan of a decade earlier. The whole was labeled the architecture of 1940X. The museum for this future city was entrusted, of course, to Mies van der Rohe, who the magazine called the nation's chief exponent of the open plan. To represent a novel museum, one that created new conditions for looking at modern works of art, which had discarded all of the perspectival traditions of painting, Mies deployed not standard elevation and section drawings that are to be found in all the other projects for 1940X, but rather these famous collages of a light pencil drawing and cut-out insertions of various works of art. More importantly, the building was to be a new frame for looking at works of art from different vantage points. As Mies explained, a work such as Picasso's Guernica has been difficult to place in any usual museum gallery. Here it can be seen in its greatest advantage and become an element in a space against a changing background. Now, because I'm a little short on time, I'm not going to go so much into analyzing this project, but I think, first of all, the landscape dimension in it, and then secondly, the object of collages, but also just compare this page layout in progressive architecture with this page layout. Also in progressive architecture for Gropius's student design. Published under Gropius's guidance, the short text that accompanied PEI's design in both the American and French publications reflects some of Gropius's major concerns in the 1940s and overlook perhaps the extent to which PEI had taken on the museum debate. So I want to suggest that we've pretty much relied too much on this text, part of which was in fact written by Gropius, and because the thing is really being published as a celebration of Gropius's studio. The text, as a result, focuses on one of the dominant debates of the decade, namely the relationship of modernism to tradition, a theme that had been given a particular framing at Harvard with Gropius and Breuer's discovery of New England wood construction as vernacular form in sympathy with their own volumetric modernism, cleanly sheathed. Of course, this was given an even greater emphasis in Siegfried Gideon's lectures, which became Space, Time, and Architecture. Significantly, it is Gropius who speaks for PEI rather than PEI for himself in these pages. As Gropius explains it, that is Gropius, it clearly illustrates that an able designer can very well build on basic traditional features which he has found are still alive without sacrificing a progressive conception of design. One of the fascinating things about this is there's very little discussion of the extraordinary spatial experience of moving between of galleries and a kind of interiorized landscape between spaces for viewing art and for viewing framed views of a kind of gardenized landscape inside. Gropius continues, when Mr. I.M. PEI and I discussed the problems of Chinese architecture, he told me that he was anxious to avoid having Chinese motifs of former periods added to public buildings in a rather superficial way, as was done for many public buildings in Shanghai. In our discussion, we tried then to find how the character of Chinese architecture could be expressed without imitating such form motifs of former periods. We decided that the bare Chinese wall, so evident to various periods of Chinese architecture, and the small individual garden patio were two eternal features which are well understood by every Chinese living. Mr. PEI built up his scheme entirely as a variation of these two themes. While Gropius is excellent in explicating the way in which PEI hoped to position the project in reaction to the debate on style in modern China, he was probably equally interested, of course, in positioning his own current work, on, as we've heard, on this university plan. So I'm going to skip over that. PEI's museum structure, in the end, skip over that too, that's what's coming. PEI's museum structure is a concrete frame of 2 stories cut into as needed to create sectional richness and entered via a dramatic ramp. But the frame is dressed in marble, an honorific befitting of its place at the heart of Shanghai's civic center, carried even on its expansive roof, cut with many more openings than those programmed by Mies in his steel frame, and visible from taller buildings nearby, since PEI's structure is embedded in the ground by a half level. Influenced both by his wife's study of landscape architecture and, as we keep hearing, his own memories of gardens of Suzhou, PEI weaves a garden through the patchwork of open courts. Gardens that can be enjoyed both at eye level and, most importantly, from above, where the section of the building is open to the sky. Rather than an abstract panoramic background, as in Mies's Museum for a Small City, PEI's museum brings the garden into direct counterpoint to art and allows it to be viewed itself as a work of art. In place of Mies's landscape, we have a commemoration of the garden as one of the highest forms of Chinese art making. On the plan, PEI labels it as a tea garden and explains the building is sunk half a level below ground in order to create walls for the main garden while permitting a view from outside. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead in my text because I'm out of time. But from the point of view of design, the incorporation of the Chinese-style garden, which fragments and fractures experience through towards greater enjoyment, enlightenment, and discovery of multiple facets of reality, the idea of an art of multiple rather than singular perspectives is not simply a landscape feature, but a way in which PEI explores a different richness of the experience of the building and the art it contains. Years later, when Art News interviewed Pei on the occasion of the East Building of the National Gallery in Washington, he recalled the lively discussion at Harvard in 1946 on the jury review of his thesis, when many saw the project as a challenge to international style orthodoxy. Breuer, Pei recalled, led the discussion. In fact, already at the time, it showed that Breuer had misgivings of his own. So I think we can wrap up here. In 1946, when he was at work on the thesis, the Chinese Civil War between the Nationalists and the Communist Party meant that return was again to be postponed. But clearly Pei still saw this as the destination. One of the youngest architects ever to teach at Harvard, it would be interesting, if we had more time, to chart the next 2 years, because the theme of the living museum gained ever in force, although it would be over a decade before Pei would himself build a museum, his early masterpiece in Syracuse. I kind of charted here, but I'm going to skip over this, the number of times he assigned a museum during his 2 years of teaching there, the debate that was occurred, particularly the Harvard archives attest to the frequent assignment of museums, and in 1947, Alexander Dorner returns. He was invited as a guest to work with the studios on the design of a living museum in the studio led by Leonard Curry. It was as much a reflection on the ethos that gave rise to Pei's thesis project the previous year, as it was in turn inspired by his project in both the framing of the issue for the next class of undergraduates and the detailing of programmatic requirements. And in many ways, it actually enters into some of the text for the influential book that Dorner wrote the year of his death, The Living Museum, Experiences of an Art Historian and Museum Director. So far from being a dead end or simply a springboard for future museums to come decades later, it actually entered into this whole debate over the museum as community center and the very way that community programs were given for the next couple of years in teaching at the GSD. So there's a few new dimensions I wanted to throw in. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barry. I wish we can give you more time. But yes, our next speaker is Eric Mumford. Eric, again, is Rebecca and John Vorl's professor of architecture at Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University. And Eric is the author of the Siam Discourse on Urbanism, 1928 to 1960, as well as the Modern Architecture in St. Louis in 2004, and Defining Urban Design, Siam Architects and the Formation of a Discipline, 1937 to 1969. And a forthcoming textbook, okay, no title, but sorry, forthcoming textbook. And Designing the Modern City, okay, this is a typo, but Designing the Modern City Urbanism Since 1850. He has also published several edited books and many scholarly articles and other publications. Eric, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me to be here, and I'd certainly like to thank Cole Roskam and Eric Chen, and also their institutions, Hong Kong University and the Harvard GSD, and also M+. So it's very exciting, actually, to be part of all of this. This talk is really about Pei in the 50s, and I think tomorrow we're going to hear also from Sarah Stevens more about some of this work. So I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about the most of the projects that Pei did when working for William Zeckendorf, the New York developer. Instead, I'll mainly be focusing on one project in particular, the Society Hill project in Philadelphia. Yeah, okay, yeah. How do you advance the slides? This is the clicker. Yeah, good. Okay, great. There's one project in Philadelphia, Society Hill, which was also then focused on at the Harvard Urban Design Conference, for the first one in 1956 and then the third in 1959. So it's really very much about sort of how Pei's work in urban design was part of this larger discourse of urban design that was beginning to develop in the 1950s, a lot of it under the leadership of Dean Jose Luis Sert, Gropius's successor at Harvard, but also I think very strongly influenced by Edmund Bacon, the Philadelphia City Planning Director, and Louis Kahn, the architect who worked with him until they had a kind of still mysterious falling out in 1954. So that's kind of the larger context. As we know, Pei received his education at the Harvard GSD in the 1940s. We've heard already quite a lot about that. Just wanted to note that Harry Cobb, Pei's partner in this firm that he founded under Webb and Knapp, William Zeckendorf's firm, was also a Harvard GSD graduate and was also part of that same context, as were quite a lot of other people, including Paul Rudolph and the landscape architect Ian McHarg. Wallace Harrison was the architect for Zeckendorf's first visions. Zeckendorf had proposed an apartment complex on the site of what became the United Nations. He donated that site to the UN for its headquarters in 1946. And you can already see in that, I think, some of Zeckendorf's visions, which he started to talk about, including at talks at the GSD in the late 1940s. Although these were produced in the heyday of slum clearance urban renewal, they also involve creating new pedestrian urban spaces and routes. These derive from several sources, including the work of Éliel Saarinen and also Le Corbusier's post-war urbanism, which we could talk about on some other occasion. These directions were also advocated by Sert, the president of CIAM, from 1947 to 1956. Much of that focus was also paralleled in a slightly different way in Philadelphia under Ed Bacon, who became planning director there in 1949, and included the CM architect Oscar Stoneroff, an emigre, and also Louis Kahn, who worked in the firm. A lot of Kahn's seminal urban design projects actually emerged out of that exact same context. These modernist urban design directions also began to take a different position toward the existing city and its landmarks. A lot of that sort of codified by Sert at CM 8 in 1951 on the theme of the heart of the city. A lot of it related to his own Latin American town planning work, most of it never built, but widely publicized at that time, including at a Museum of Modern Art exhibition called Two Cities in 1947. So all of these directions were, I think, evident and part of Pei's work in the 1950s, including projects like the Courthouse Square and Mile High Center in Denver, the first projects he did for Zeckendorf, and then also at the Place Ville-Marie, the mixed-use office complex he designed in Montreal, where Harry Cobb played a significant role, and also Vincent Ponte, who did a lot of the underground shopping concourse that had a kind of transformative effect on downtown Montreal at that time. While these projects themselves were widely publicized at the time and are relatively well known, the intellectual context that informed them and their importance to the history of urbanism is still not as clearly understood. In this paper, I argue that Pei's urban design work for Zeckendorf was closely related to the revisionist modernist approaches to urban design that began to be advocated in the early 50s by Bacon as well as by Sert, and the former, I think, rooted also in Bacon's education with Éliel Saarinen at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. This approach can be seen emerging in Pei's plan for Zeckendorf's proposed redevelopment of Southwest Washington, which included an urban armature that, with a 300-foot wide pedestrian promenade linking the 19th century Smithsonian Institution south across a railway cut from the center of Washington to new higher density neighborhoods to the south. Like many such plans in the immediate post-war years, the Zeckendorf plan was premised on the clearance of a largely what was defined as a slum area, which was in this case, as in many cases, majority African American. So there are a whole lot of issues around that, which I won't get into in this paper, but certainly some of these projects do participate also in that aspect of urban renewal. That was not so much true at some of Pei's other projects. It was partially true at Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago took the lead in renovating its neighborhood as it was beginning to racially integrate. Pei and the architect Harry Weiss developed a new townhouse typology that Pei would then use also in Philadelphia for that project. It was also, I think, not so much about slum clearance in his New York project, Kips Bay, which he was very proud of, kind of a series of large slab buildings organized into a kind of pinwheel pattern with a lot of public space at the base that was the immediate predecessor to the Society Hill project. So as all that was going on with PEI, CERT was beginning to advocate parallel ideas after his appointment as dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Design in 1953. CERT tried to involve PEI more in the GSD in the 50s, but PEI was too busy with these projects for Seckendorf. And there may well be parallels between the first use of the term urban design in these Harvard conferences with the developments in Philadelphia and also PEI's own work for Seckendorf. That would really be a topic for further research in the PEI archives. CERT certainly advocated the idea of the civic in architecture, of having buildings related to one another and to the open spaces around them, which he saw as should be conceived and built in a planned environment, very much similar to ideas Lewis Mumford, the critic to whom I'm not related, was putting forward at the same time. So the contrast with planning before this is, I think, really the important point, that this was an era where decentralization was still most planners' goals. It was the era of the interstate program announced by President Eisenhower in 1956 of mass-produced suburbia, things like Levittown, lots and lots of transformations of cities in a decentralizing direction. And so it's right at this same moment that you have CERT beginning to advocate this idea of urban design for dense pedestrian kinds of environments. And this is well before the postmodernist taking up of these ideas in the 1960s and 70s. With urban design, CERT was attempting to retain the main values of CM, but rather than decrying the superdensity of older urban centers, as most modern architects had done in the pre-war period, CERT sought to use architecture and urban design to foster a civic culture in ways that paralleled these other critics like Lewis Mumford, and aside, really, I would say, of Le Corbusier at the same time. CERT's organization of the Urban Design Conference was assisted by Jacqueline Turrett, the British planner who had been involved with the CM8 conference. Turrett began teaching at Harvard in 1955 and began to really be a major advocate for these ideas, not only at Harvard, but also in her work with Konstantinos Doxiadis, the Greek planner with whom she started working in the late 50s on the magazine Ekistics, which she edited down into the early 80s. And so there's a kind of global dimension to all of this, which again is really not yet been fully studied in relation, I think, to the American side of this topic. Some of these ideas, of course, already evident, as I mentioned, in CERT's Latin American town planning work, mostly unbuilt but quite influential on CERT's teaching in urban design in the 1950s. So at the 1956 conference, there were 3 case studies, one of downtown Pittsburgh, which had begun in 1949, kind of classic clearance and rebuilding, but rather than for public housing, for office uses, and so it's seen as a kind of pioneering model of urban renewal beginning to engage the private sector. Also at that same event, Charles Abrams, the New York City Housing Authority founder and UN consultant in the 1950s, began to point out that there was this whole racial issue beginning to emerge in American cities, the topic of his book of 1955, Forbidden Neighbors. It was also at that event in 1956 that Jane Jacobs, then a journalist working for Architectural Forum, first began to call for neighborhood street life as a value in planning, leading eventually to her critique of 1961, which basically then kind of ended in some ways this whole direction of master planning and the idea of Corbusian sort of urbanism as the solution to American urban problems. It's also interesting at the 1956 conference that Georgi Kepish discussed some of the research he was then doing with Kevin Lynch at MIT on the perceptual form of the city, which was then published by Lynch as The Image of the City in 1960. And so a whole lot of different currents of urbanism, some of which are still around today, I think all converging at that point. So these 3 case studies, the Pittsburgh development, Victor Gruen's Fort Worth Tomorrow, where he proposed pedestrianizing downtown Fort Worth, something supported by the local utility company, and then also Ed Bacon presenting the Philadelphia work, where he gave a lot of credit at that point to Louis Kahn as the kind of person who generated a lot of these ideas about greenways as linking elements in the city, tying together existing landmarks like Independence Hall, various other historic historic buildings, and using those as a way of kind of creating a new urban structure that could then also accommodate new buildings. And you could see some prefiguring of that in some of Stoneroff's renovations of existing row houses, as well as some of Stoneroff's later work, which I won't talk about, in Philadelphia. One of the projects that was actually built that demonstrated this, Louis Kahn's Mill Creek project in West Philadelphia, which had 3 towers, which have since been demolished, but also included row houses, this even before the PEI and Weiss Hyde Park project, as well as greenways and efforts to pedestrianize some of the neighborhood streets. And Kahn himself saw this as one of his most influential urban projects. So I think all of this is kind of the context then of PEI's work at the same time. Society Hill begins in 1957. It's another urban renewal project. It also got federal Title I funding. I won't go into all the details of all of that. The project was prepared by a staff in Bacon's office that did a lot of studies of the neighborhood. Willo von Moltke, who had worked earlier for Eero Saarinen on the Brandeis campus master plan, was brought in by Bacon around this time and became later the director of the urban design program at Harvard in the 1960s. And so very interesting context of trying to develop urban design guidelines, beginning to emphasize the importance of historic neighborhoods, trying in some way to relate the new buildings to the existing context. Most of that beginning in 1957, even before PEI comes in and then wins the competition based on those guidelines around that time. And so the PEI project then becomes seen as a kind of model at the 3rd Harvard Urban Design Conference in 1959. It's discussed along with a series of other urban projects of that same time. You have what's called Washington Square in this listing, also a project confusingly also called Mill Creek in St. Louis, also a PEI project that I'll mention in a minute, as well as the well-known Lafayette Park development in Detroit, designed by Mies and Ludwig Hilbersheimer, and SOM's Lake Meadows project in Chicago, and also 2 suburban projects, Toronto Newtown and the new town of Vallingby outside of Stockholm. So the PEI project for St. Louis never went very far. This was a project that was an area called the Mill Creek Valley that had been historically the center of African-American settlement in this part of St. Louis. It was a very dense, very old neighborhood, mostly going back to the 1870s, completely cleared in 1959. The Zeckendorf project ran into problems because Zeckendorf wanted to hire African-Americans in the construction, something that was being called for by the NAACP at that time, and this was actually resisted. And so, in fact, Zeckendorf then kind of pulled out. Various other architects, including ultimately Clotilde Woodard Smith, ended up designing a project called Laclede Town on the site. I won't go into all the details of all that. It's all subsequently been demolished. The other projects that were also talked about at this conference, besides Society Hill, included Lafayette Park in Detroit, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and the Lake Meadows apartment near the IIT campus, both more classic kind of pre-war CM type high-rise projects. So Society Hill became a major focus of the event. And the idea was to look at how it sort of defined urban design. It was analyzed by an invited panel that included Sert, Bacon, PEI, and Stoneroff, along with Martin Meyerson, then teaching at the GSD in planning, as well as the developer Jerome Rappaport, the Federal Urban Renewal Administrator William Slayton, and the landscape architect Garrett Ekbo. The panel report emphasized the importance of urban design guidelines visually expressed for projects of this kind, a point reiterated by Sert in his panel comments, as well as the need for better training for the personnel involved, which was the goal then of the newly founded GSD Urban Design Program, which opened in 1960. In his panel comments, PEI saw immense financial value in the approach taken at Society Hill, as Bacon's city planning department had already built up a knowledge base about the project. Robert Little, a GSD graduate and Cleveland architect, suggested that there were no other American cities that had an architecturally urban design planning director like Bacon, which was why Philadelphia is ahead of the rest of us in urban design. Sert had also said at this conference that he thought it would be useless to continue the discussions on general topics, which have been sort of the focus of the earlier ones, and instead try to focus more specifically on these 6 projects. Dean Joe Passanow of Washington University talked briefly about the Philadelphia Mill Creek Valley project, but was more enthusiastic about the Society Hill plan, saying the greatest value of the Philadelphia project is in its linkage with the past and its spatial linkages which create focal points. This is a project which does not imply a completion date in itself at all because it started in the 18th century, has 19th century buildings, and can grow on to have buildings in the future. The panel concluded that PEI successfully developed its basic concept, that the relationship between high and low buildings expressed in the project was a positive one, and at the same time an attitude of conservation toward all existing useful elements, buildings, trees, water, and land is desirable. They also noted that people's needs and preferences and their abilities and willingness to pay for what they want as expressed in marketability must be taken into account. In the various thematic discussions of these and other projects at the 3rd Harvard Urban Design Conference, Sert praised the Society Hill project and the way that Bacon and his associates had provided urban design directives for the invited competitors to successfully shape the results. So all of this, I think, is kind of the moment, really, where a lot of the ideas we now associate with more postmodern urban design actually seem to have coalesced. It's a point, really, where there's a kind of a kind of revulsion against what was then the mainstream of planning. In fact, there are actually critical comments about Brasilia in the proceedings of the 3rd Harvard Urban Design Conference, where Costa famously decided not to have a pedestrian heart of the city, but rather just the sort of crossing point of 2 highways. This basically rejected in favor of this more pedestrian-based approach. And I'll end it there. I'm not really an expert on PEI, but there are, in fact, other projects after this, certainly the NYU project that PEI did a few years later, and as well as his quite interesting invention in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood in the late 60s, a Great Society project, where you can see further development of some of the ideas that he had begun to put forward at Society Hill in Philadelphia. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. The next speaker is Seng Kwan. Seng Kwan is a lecturer at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's an architectural historian with a scholarly focus on 20th century and contemporary architectural and urban design in Japan and China. He has published extensively on the architectural and urban culture of East Asia, most notably Kenzo Tange, Architecture for the World, as well as Shanghai, Architecture and Modernism for Modern China, and Architectural Encounters with Essence and Form in Modern China. His curatorial work includes Metabolism, The City of the Future at Mori, and Utopia Across Scales, highlights from the Kenzo Tange archive at the GSD. Seng Kwan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Shirley, for this introduction, and of course thanks to Eric Chen and Cole Roscom and Nazreen Siraji for organizing and hosting this wonderful occasion. So 10 years ago, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Miho Art Museum outside of Kyoto, I had the good fortune of being called in by Maki Fumiko to help with an interview he'd like to do with I.M. Pei, who was visiting Tokyo at the time. It turned out to be a free-flowing conversation between the two of them for the better part of the day. One of the topics they dwelled upon was the relationship between art and architecture, stemming from discussions on the Miho's collection. My presentation today originates from this encounter with Mr. Pei 10 years ago, trying to come to terms with an episode that has been lingering in my mind ever since, namely the little-known role of Jean Dubuffet in Pei's pursuit of scale and form. During this conversation, Pei listed 4 modern sculptures whose work he found to be scaleless. Four modern sculptures he had collaborated with. Scaleless was his word, which I took to mean, at least in part, as figural but sufficiently de-anthropomorphized and abstract. it also implied that the sculptures had the potential to be enlarged, made commensurate with the institutional and urban scale, with the kind of institutional and urban scale work that Pei's office was focusing on. So the four artists were Pablo Picasso, Henry Moore, Joan Miro, and Jean Dubuffet. The Picasso piece, Bust of Sylvette in New York, and Henry Moore's The Arch in Columbus, Indiana, are very well known. It is easy in these cases to see what Pei meant. The two are among the largest pieces also in their respective artists' sculptural oeuvre. These pieces are also very effective in mediating, in an inherently classical manner, the scale of the human body with that of the post-war modernist city. To follow up on Eric Mumford's presentation just now, these oversized sculptures also perform an important placemaking function, choreographing meaningful spatial experiences through the city, as in the whimsy of the peekaboo moment in New York with the monumental, or the monumental gateway marking an urban core in Columbus, Indiana. Works by Miro are also featured in a number of Pei's buildings, most notably Personage and Birds outside the Texas Commerce Tower building in Houston. The other major piece by Miro in Pei's buildings is a large tapestry that was part of the original collection commissioned for the atrium of the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art, to which we shall turn soon. When it came to Jean Dubuffet, the fourth member on this list of holies, both Mak Sang and I did a double take. We were not quite expecting this kind of applause for the champion of Art Brut from an architect so renowned for a supreme sense of decorum and refinement. Before going into the story of the unwelcome Dubuffet, referring to the Welcome Parade, the name of the ensemble, the project that Dubuffet had proposed for the East Wing, let us spend a few minutes on Picasso's NYU sculpture at NYU's University Village, which of course was built to get a sense of how sculptural works informed Pei's architecture and urbanism. In the last 17 years of Picasso's life, between 1956 and 1973, he collaborated with the Norwegian artist Carl Nasjar on a series of concrete sculptures and murals, yielding a total of 34 works. R.M. Pei recounts an accidental encounter at a restaurant in Paris, most likely in 1958, where Nasjar was showing his lunch companions a photograph of Picasso's Head of a Woman, which Nasjar had just completed in Oslo. Pei was seated close enough to the Norwegians to get a glimpse of the photo and eventually follow them back to Oslo to see it. Some of you might know the version that was also a collaboration between Picasso and Nasjar on Princeton's campus of the same name, but that's actually a much later version with the same title. So the technique used by Nasjar in translating Picasso's artistic visions into concrete form was built on a technology developed by the architect Erling, I'm going to screw this up, Viksjord, responsible for the ensemble of brutalist government buildings in downtown Oslo that's currently slated, I think, for demolition, very controversially. Viksjord called this technique naturbeton, or nature concrete, the combination of carefully selected, typically dark-colored basalt aggregate from Norway with a soft, light-colored mortar. Just before this concrete mixture is completely cured, Nasjar would sandblast its surface to the desired designs, in effect engravings done on concrete and at monumental scale. Picasso typically did not accept payments, notably for these projects, including the Sylvette project at NYU. No doubt this magnanimity harks back to the Guernica and the ideals of public art. Picasso was nonetheless very pleased with the promise of permanence or perhaps even immortality to these works, which Nasjar projected would last 2,000 years. Although R.M. Pei encountered Nasjar's work quite early, still in the 50s, they had to wait almost a full decade for the chance to realize a collaborative work between the two of them. The meager budget that Zeckendorf and the Federal Housing Agency allow for the courtyard at Kips Bay only provided for some trees. PEI also toyed with the idea of a Picasso for Society Hill in Philadelphia, though he eventually settled on the piece by Gaston Lachaise, the floating figure placed closer to the townhouses, as you can see, and the commissioned sculptural triad by Leonard Baskin at the foot of the towers. PEI's persistence for a piece by Picasso finally came to fruition with the bust of Sylvette at NYU, when PEI secured financial support from his neighbor and art patron, Alain Emile. As a prelude to other things to come, a Henry Moore was also contemplated for the same site. At 11.59 meters tall and purportedly weighing 60 tons, Sylvette is one of the largest pieces amongst the series of monumental concrete sculptures by Picasso and Neschat. Picasso would always carefully study the site photographs and even scaled architectural drawings and models, all channeled through Neschat, who would, of course, visit the site and be responsible for the fabrication. Picasso's small maquettes would be translated by Neschat into construction drawings, which would be, of course, presented again to Picasso for final approval before fabrication. The final dimensions of Sylvette, rising approximately 3 stories tall, were carefully determined by Neschat together with PEI's team by floating balloons in the middle of the courtyard of University Village. In its eventual location in the southeastern corner of the lawn of University Garden, Sylvette anchors the famous pinwheel configuration of the 3 high-rise residential towers, each rising to 80 meters. As we turn to the east wing of the National Gallery of Art, it is useful to revisit some of the key aspects of its design, which I'm sure already familiar to most of you. In terms of spatial planning, the foremost consideration seems to be the balance between a series of rather intimately scaled galleries versus the expansive atrium in the center that forms a sort of reception hall that on this key location along Pennsylvania Avenue. J. Carter Brown, the director of the NGA, famously claimed that no museum experience should involve more than 10,000 square feet. At the other end of the scale spectrum, the atrium has continued to be the site of evening galas and various gatherings of Washington's elite in the 40 years since the opening of the building, as shown here on the occasion of a visit by the Prince and Princess of Wales in 1985 for an exhibition on the treasures of British country houses. Still in the early stages of the project, I.M. PEI and J. Carter Brown and a core team of museum professionals from the NGA began working on a series of commissioned pieces to be installed in the new atrium. Carter Brown credits I.M. PEI, in fact, for this initiative. PEI's intense interest in these artworks, Brown notes, stemmed from his nervousness over the immense scale of the interior space. Quote, he felt that any work of art that would come off the shelf would be overwhelmed by it. Carter Brown, and probably along together with all the curators, did not really see this atrium as an exhibition space, at least in the early planning stage. It is seldom recognized that the old Pope building, which we saw from Barry Bergdahl's presentation, was still not completely filled when the project for the East Wing was initiated. There was no shortage of square footage in the old NGA, just the wrong kind of gallery space. Commissioning new sculptural works was also against the collections policy of the NGA at the time of not buying anything by living artists. So an ad hoc collectors committee was eventually formed to allow for gifts of 20th century art, focusing on established masters while they were still alive. And you can see how this move has obviously paid off handsomely for the NGA in multiple ways. So these works, eventually, the works specifically commissioned for the building, for the opening, included the famous Calder Mobile, a large tapestry by Miro, another piece of tapestry by Jean Arp, Anthony Carroll's ledge piece hang over the entrance to Casva and Administrative Building, James Rossetti, and a Lieberman outside the building. As you can see here installed, it's the top left corner of the screen, installed along the northern facade of the east wing. A number of pieces were also purchased specifically for the occasion, such as the piece by Isamu Noguchi. At the beginning, so of course all of us know that there's a famous, the Henry Moore. This piece now sits at the entrance portico to the east wing. But at the beginning, there was also supposed to be a Dubuffet, where the Moore currently sits. A sculpture, a different piece by Henry Moore, was originally meant for the northern Pennsylvania side of the building. In fact, the only place where PEI's trapezoidal massing of the building is broken is a small platform jutting out a triangular, of course, that was specifically designed for this piece by Henry Moore. This uncomfortable protrusion has since been nicknamed by the NGA's curators as Henry's Point. As you can imagine, Moore was not exactly thrilled by this location, which never got direct sunlight, and bargained hard for the prime location. Even without PEI's preference for Dubuffet, Henry Moore was never the first choice for the main entrance. Even Carter Brown admitted that it was in fact a cliché. The Hirshhorn, which preceded the East Wing by just a couple years, finished I think in 1974, installed, of course, a large Henry Moore in front of the building, together with many other institutional commissions all over the United States in the late 60s and early 70s. But the Moore, of course, was a safe and uncontroversial choice. PEI was the chief advocate for a sculptural piece ensemble by Jean Dubuffet, which he worked tirelessly for 4 years for the board to accept. In his recollections, PEI claims to have met Jean Dubuffet in New York in 1966, as Dubuffet was preparing for an exhibition at the Guggenheim. Eileen was particularly close to him. The PEIs had some of Dubuffet's paintings and drawings, and liked to find out exactly which ones they were. But in the early 60s, Dubuffet went through a phase of intense engagement and criticism of the city. This must have appealed to PEI, quote, an out of the ordinary way of seeing things. He saw things new in New York that I didn't, and he enjoyed the chaos of it. These are words by PEI on Dubuffet's vision of modern urbanity in the American sense. Perhaps the most revealing comment made by PEI on Jean Dubuffet's work is that, quote, he created an environment with his art, not just as objects, end quote. The Guggenheim exhibition, titled, which opened in 1966, represented an important turning point in his career. This most recent body of work was the beginnings of the so-called lower loop phase, a series of gauche and collage abstractions. The lower loop is Dubuffet's response to the city. This 23rd period in the artist's career grew out of automatic doodlings he made while he was on the telephone, wanderings of his pen, always in red or blue. Dubuffet started working in an architectural manner in the early 60s with a commission from André Malraux for 2 painting murals for the new university in Nanterre. While the project was not carried out, presaging the fate of the vast majority of works in Dubuffet's lower loop cycle, he began working with ceramics and other media to add thickness and volume to initial mural works. In the 1960s, Dubuffet started working with a new technique of sculpting with expanded polystyrene using hot wire, essentially to sculpt them and form them. Fabricated in polyester with polyurethane paint, Le Mur Bleu was the first realized work by Dubuffet in monumental scale, measuring eventually 7 meters long and 3.5 meters high. Pei approached Dubuffet with the commission in December of 1970 for the National Gallery of Art's new building, initially for an entire room, one of the new galleries, but this was quickly upgraded to the building's main entrance. Finally, 4 years later, in June of 1974, in the studio, Dubuffet presented a maquette of 5 figures, which he titled The Welcome Parade. Carter Brown, I.M. Pei, and numerous other members, professional staff of the NGA's planning committee were also in attendance. If Carter Brown had harbored any hesitation toward the pieces then, he hid it very well. The maquettes were subsequently sent to Washington for review by the trustees. An empty gallery, in fact, in the old Pope building, was used to restage the same configuration as presented in Dubuffet's studio. Despite Pei's tremendous enthusiasm for the Dubuffet, the commission was put into, quote, abeyance after a closed meeting of the board. Paul Mellon was against the Dubuffet, to be sure. Carter Brown's position was rather more ambiguous. While he expressed tremendous enthusiasm for this work, accompanying Pei on these visits to Dubuffet's atelier in Paris, Carter Brown will eventually come out essentially commenting that the figures, the specific pieces of the Welcome Parade were just, quote, too looking so sad and so disagreeable. So it would not be right for this particular location on Pennsylvania Avenue. So this is another quote from Carter Brown. There's a place and time for everything. I just felt that the Welcome Parade was not appropriate, was not an appropriate expression of upbeat joy that we wanted to have people face the East Building with. While others, such as Barry Bergdahl, have noted that Marcel Breuer played a large role in initiating Pei to the world of modern art, it was really Gordon Bunshaft of SOM who served as IM and Eileen Pei's sponsor in building friendships with artists like Henry Moore and Jean Dubuffet. And this is a quote from Mr. Pei. Gordon Bunshaft was interested in art, not necessarily for buildings. He was interested in art as a collector. I was interested in art for my buildings. How to make art complement buildings. The big challenge I had working on modern museums 30 years ago was one of scale. How to make art go with modern buildings. You cannot imagine a Giacometti in front of these buildings. You could not because scale was no longer adequate, end quote. While Bunshaft's Hirshon was the chief competitor to the East Wing in redefining Washington's cultural and physical landscape, we need to turn to another building by Bunshaft, the Chase Manhattan, to complete the Dubuffet story at the East Wing. Led by David Rockefeller, the Chase Manhattan convened really truly a star-studded arts committee consisting of Alfred Barr, Jr., Dorothy Miller, both from MoMA, and James Sweeney from the Guggenheim. Gordon Bunshaft was also a member of the Arts Committee, which entitled him to a vote that, unfortunately, that I.M. Pei did not at the East Wing. Early on in 1958, the Arts Committee had further sought, already in part of the original architectural design, Bunshaft had incorporated a sunken courtyard designed by Isamu Noguchi, as you can see here in the slide. But early on, the Arts Committee further sought a large sculptural piece to anchor the upper plaza level. The shortlist consisted, again, of the usual personages, Calder, Moore, Noguchi, Giacometti, amongst others, with Giacometti eventually prevailing in the initial round. Bunshaft's initial suggestion to Giacometti was for a version of City Square, with only 3 figures, but each enlarged to over 60 feet tall. Clearly, the initial struggle at the Chase Manhattan Plaza on a 2.5-acre urban platform in the shadow of a 60-story building was to establish a satisfactory scale and relationship to the ground. This was, in fact, consistent with the overall architectural scheme behind SOM's presentation to the Chase's board. that the design was the only one amongst the competing proposals to situate the new skyscraper in the overall urban context of Lower Manhattan. Giacometti agonized for more than 7 years, on and off, on the Chase Manhattan project, from 1958 all the way through his death in 1966. The final version he proposed was a group of larger-than-life sculptures, the standing woman, walking man, and monumental head, an anthological triad of the perennial motifs that he struggled with for the last 2 decades of his life. While Giacometti deeply cherished the possibility of realizing a monumental work in the public environment, the Chase Commission was complicated by his lack of familiarity with the context of New York, which he had never visited and was in fact quite skeptical of. He became quickly disenchanted with the whole thing and put it aside 2 years later after the commission in 1961. But Giacometti presented some version of his proposal for the Chase Manhattan triad a year later at the Venice Biennale in 1962, and a different iteration of the same thing shown here on the screen at the Fondation Met in 1964. Finally, in fall of 1965, just 1 year before his death, he visited New York for the first time, and on the occasion of his solo retrospective at MoMA. During his stay in New York, Giacometti visited the Chase Manhattan site multiple times, always at night, and managed to return the project a few months before his death. It was only then that the Chase Manhattan's Arts Committee, after he died, turned to Dubuffet, leading to the group of 4 Trees project that all of you might be familiar with making it Dubuffet's first major triumph in public sculpture. The plaza at the Chase Manhattan finally had an anchoring piece of sculpture unveiled in September of 1972. PEI must have followed Bunshaft and Giacometti's travails at the Chase Manhattan closely. Part of the reason in Giacometti's initial abandonment of the project, as critics such as Arthur Danto have noted, is that these enlargements of composition scaled for eye-level contact fundamentally subverts the innate poetry and intimacy of Giacometti's work. It would have been fabricated by somebody else, with a method completely alien to him, becoming an effigy and ultimately a mere object. There's no potential for empathy looking into the eyes of these molten figures that is so essential for his work. One of the few awards Dubuffet ever accepted was a medal from the American Institute of Architects, given in 1982. The citation reads, "His works provide not only scale, focus, color, and texture, but clear insights into the nature of architecture that they complement, its space, volume, structure, and surface, blending architecture and sculpture into a single entity." In his reply, as the French architectural theorist Hubert Demisch recounts, Dubuffet subverted this implied hierarchy between sculpture and structure in AIA citation. Quote, "My work points in a direction that can inspire architecture to explore rich possibilities where we could begin to see new structures from which symmetry, rectilinear elements, and right angles would be excluded." End quote. While the commissions indeed came from the architects, Dubuffet did not see the work as being merely complementary, or supplementary as Demisch added, but with the potential to inspire something altogether separate and different. Neither Giacometti nor Dubuffet ultimately cared for these modernist architecture. What they both aspired to was the suggestion of movement, and along with it, emotions that were contingent upon the specific space and environment that was utterly alien to them. In conclusion, I want to just return briefly to a Figaro and human scale piece by Maillot. It occupied this quiet spot behind the reception desk in the atrium of the East Wing for many years, well liked for its ability to lend a living room quality to the atrium. Ma Yu, of course, was one of 3 sculptors whom Mies featured more or less exclusively in his buildings. These works played an essential role in the Barcelona Pavilion and the Museum of, for a Small City, as we saw just now, to reinforce the idea of the sense of transparency, to add mass, and to provide orientation. I'm deeply drawn to these failed projects, however, by Dubuffet at the East Wing and Giacometti at the Chase Manhattan, because they try to address an entirely new set of problems for modernism in the post-war era, beyond scale, materiality, and depth. In this sense, these projects were doomed for failure from the beginning, a symptom of perhaps the incommensurability of the modernist condition, but offer the critical potential to fundamentally transform architecture and urban design. And I think for this reason, ultimately, that the Dubuffet was not realized at the East Wing became a topic of major, I think, disappointment toward IMPs in more recent years. Thank you very much.
Where's Eric? Ah, Eric and Barry, would you please come up for the panel discussion? Thank you. Like a lot of stuff. Let me see if I can even like digest them all and ask decent questions. But I will just ask, I think 2, oh, is it even working? Hello, hi, yes, okay. I have 2 lingering questions, attempt to digest as I attempt. And I will just, after that, I will completely open it up. So it will only take hopefully 10 minutes of your time. And so I think my first response, immediate response that is something that I could find as a thread. Oh, by the way, I will not be as provocative as Tu Tao in my moderation, so I can't I can't interpret every single bit of your response. So I'll just ask a big question. And so one of my question was really about it's first of all, I just wanted to say that it's I think all of us here who organized this symposium is very glad of the angle in which you chose to approach PEI's work. They're all really fresh perspectives in a way, especially, like, I think even like Eric was very clear to say, oh, I'm not an IMP expert, and so on and so forth. And that happened as well, even in the GSD symposium, because nobody had really studied him as a very natural kind of a biographical sort of a path. And so this is all very adventurous for us to actually consider his thesis project in light of the modern museum of art debate, in light of the urban design discourse of Siam, even in light of like so-called the other artists that could have almost, I guess, almost threw a new light into how PEI actually perceived his own buildings. So these are all really new set of questions. But at the same time, I also couldn't help, I don't know whether the public, the audience here feel the same way, that there was also a little bit of a distance between the examples that you were bringing up in terms of the debate for the museums, a debate on the on urban design with the specificity of PEI's projects in some ways. But I'm not saying for all of them, but there was a little bit of like, okay, here's a huge survey of what was happening, and then this is what PEI's project was, and there could be some links. And so I think this is all like very, again, this is only a preliminary study into his work, but I just wanted to go back a little bit, one step further in terms of asking how you chose, why do you choose, what frameworks do you choose to study his work, and why? You've already addressed this, of course, in the paper as you kind of like touched on it in the introduction, but I just wanted to kind of get at what was the challenge of actually trying to study him by relating it to a bigger context, or almost a strange context that other biographers have not studied him before. And why do you think, even in its incompleteness of understanding, it's still a very important attempt to study him in this particular way? So I hope my question wasn't too broad, but is that okay, Larry? For all of you 3. Yes.
I just this on. Okay. I guess mine was a personal, or let's say a self-correction, because quite a number of years ago on the occasion of a symposium at the National Gallery on, I think it was the 25th anniversary, not being a PEI specialist even then, and I was working on Breuer, and I was in Syracuse all the time, and I became obsessed with the Everson Museum as an unsung masterpiece of American architecture and of museum architecture of the time, and I tried to contextualize that building in very specifically in its particular decade, and to relate it to a number of buildings that were emerging as a critique of an earlier modernist model, and I had just randomly thrown in the thesis project but hadn't really paid attention to it. And I had always wanted to go back and try to understand it. I thought it was a little bit too glib to simply put it next to Mies van der Rohe and leave it at that. I think underlying your question is, and my own frustration, because I prepared much more than I could present in 25 minutes, is that I didn't give an adequate formal reading of that project in and of itself. And there is so much more at stake in it than what I was able to simply map out here. I suppose I felt in the context of today, a little bit compensated for the lack of specific formal reading by the fact that I think it picked up quite specifically with where we left the conversation before lunch. And I hope I showed as much as it might be ostensibly for Shanghai, and it would be very interesting to try to literally place that building on a site and think of it urbanistically in Shanghai as he is remembering it rather than experiencing it. It is really so profoundly taking a position, at once in a way collage composite on many, many different figures, but it also fits in very nicely with a very, very vibrant moment of thinking about the museum space. And I cut off my last couple of pages because of the shortage of time, but just in glancing at archives at GSD, how much that became a program of instruction to reflect upon, and how central the museum was as a topic to think about rebuilding community and the social issues of the immediate post-war period, and not as a kind of aesthetic temple of for housing works of art, but this whole idea of the museum as cultural center, and that thesis project is very much a response. So I suppose it's a very long-winded way of saying that I really wanted to show, and I think everything that we saw today was how deeply attuned PEI was, and this is a counterpoint to this morning, deeply attuned PEI was to exactly what was going on in the US at that moment, and taking a position and a position that mattered. I suppose there's a little bit of footnote of that, and just because Michael Hayes is sitting right in front of me, I think there would be an interesting way of looking at these student projects, in the way all student projects always are, in the conflict zone. So I put it in national debate, but in the end it's PEI's returned from the real world to Harvard, so like a lot of people immediately after the war, he's not a student like today. He has a lot of real world experience that he's bringing into. But nonetheless, any student project is also in a force field between homage and conflict between their instructors and various models. So that project, presented to Gropius, but it seems to have much more to do with thinking about Mies and Corbusier than any Gropius project of the period, much as his classmate Philip Johnson is doing a Miesian courthouse down the street from the school, even while he's studying with Gropius and Breuer. And so the ways in which these student projects themselves are always simultaneously acts of rebellion and homage in trying to find a language. My main motif was simply to liberate that project and elevate it to at least the place where we can start to do a formal reading of it, rather than seeing it as the kind of student work leading to a major museum practitioner of many years later, because it's usually cited, oh, look what a precocious museum architect PEI is.
I just wanted to add to Barry, because I think he also provided a reading about, I I guess, spend the time to read about the Chinese garden spatiality that exists in his museum that could be different from all the other similar student projects for art museums. Because I think even Wan Da Hong did a kind of a similar artwork within a space. Sort of everybody was just, I think, preoccupied with this idea about the presence of the art in a space, in a glass box particularly. So I think I'm just curious about, were you convinced about the kind of those features that there was debated this morning, about that aspect of how this museum has to be different spatial in terms of its spatiality because of its location and because of the nature of art that had to be displayed there? Were you convinced of that? Yes.
No, I'm not 100% convinced,
Okay.
because what I would
Right.
really love to find as someone once referred to me as a relentless contextualizer. What I would really love to find is the period discussion on how one views Chinese art.
Sure.
And to know if that played a role as well. So the ability to develop a richer section, even in a pancake building, in order to have plunging views and various views and changing views, is not unique to Pei's project. So I think that would be too easy of an association. But that, for me, is an undone bit of research to try to reconstruct what would have been any period discussion about the differences between. So, it is not just the architecture that shifts in the collage from Mies to Pei. It's the choosing of Chinese artifacts to collage into the space. So that's kind of undone piece there. I would just underscore, because maybe I didn't say it strongly enough, I was trying a bit in counter to this morning, if I couldn't have known that, to emphasize that this integration of landscape into the idea of the living art museum is something that you find in the Guggenheim in a very different way. This is a kind of leitmotif at the moment. So that, I think, is interesting for the discussion we were having this morning about, Chinese, Western, etc., or more emphatically, that binary is too limiting. Because as much as, and that's also I wanted to underscore the fact that the text of that article is clearly written by Gropius. It's not written by Pei. And so, Gropius is putting it in what he's interested in. In a certain sense, is Gropius using Pei as Chinese to present this Chinese project?
I think there's a couple of
Many more
interesting.
questions.
There's a couple of things I probably should have emphasized a little more in terms of Joseph Hudnut was very much in favor. Okay. Joseph Hudnut was very much in favor of this integration of architecture, landscape, and planning, which I think is kind of the theme that then a lot of other figures there take up. And so, Gropius certainly was advocating that at a certain point, as was Sert. But I think there's an earlier discourse about it that really, Eliel Saarinen is important, and Barry showed the Smithsonian Museum, which I think is a very important project that's largely forgotten, that Hudnut actually had the model of that on display at the GSD in the 40s.
Well, that was the MoMA show that came.
Right, exactly. So I think there's really a kind of earlier prehistory that then somebody like Ed Bacon is actually continuing in his Philadelphia planning. And Louis Kahn is then kind of participating in that. So it's a very complex set of relationships that Pei comes into and then in a way manages to realize these projects, which is, I think, what, initially I was always thought of Pei as kind of like not so seminal a figure. And then you realize at a certain point that no, he's actually able to carry these things out in a much more convincing way than most of the other figures involved. So I think that that's kind of the strength of this sort of ongoing conversation, is that you begin to get a sense of Pei as someone not just a star architect who was valorized at a certain moment, but rather was able to somehow extend the discipline in these ways that had been called for, but hadn't yet fully been realized up to that point. And so the thesis sort of does that in the museum context, and then I think the the Society Hill project is like the demonstration of the sort of urban potential of some of these ideas. Another thing I also probably should have mentioned is that Ed Bacon was very interested in Chinese gardens himself, and had actually spent time in China, and attributed a lot of his interest in urbanism to his time he spent. He actually worked, I think, for Henry Murphy briefly in Shanghai. So there's a whole other layer there that could probably be excavated about these kinds of connections and the importance of the Chinese garden to a certain way of thinking about American urbanism at that time.
Sorry, I just one more question for Eric. I think you were saying that you only realized that he is a seminal figure in the field of urban design only when you realized that he was able to execute the type of approaches that were discussed in these conferences.
Yes, exactly. If you look at the Victor Gruen project, which conceptually is a very appealing project of pedestrianizing all of downtown Fort Worth, it wasn't carried out. So it remained this kind of image or model that Team 10 and other people would keep talking about. But PEI, on the other hand, was actually able to then carry out these projects. And to the point where I think they then became almost seen as banal at a certain point because they were so familiar and that everybody knew them. And when I was a student in Cambridge in the 70s, PEI was it was a tired kind of idea because it was so familiar that everywhere you went. And I think that's kind of interfered in a way with our ability to appreciate what he was able to accomplish at that time when many American cities were in fact decentralizing and de-urbanizing.
Right. So was his lack of I guess presence or importance at that point was because he was not actively participating in the discourse?
Well,
is that
I think
writing or
he was in the sense that this third Harvard Urban Design Conference is a relatively rare point where he's actually talking about some of these ideas. I think otherwise, yeah, he was kind of the classic modern architect who built rather than talked. It's kind of a Mies model, really. And I think that also has probably maybe been part of the difficulty people have had in appreciating his achievement in urbanism, relative to, say, Kahn, who wasn't able to build as much, but drew and talked and became this very important point of reference.
I think, Sang, you have the most personal story, like motivation, because you had that conversation with Monkey and about art and architecture, and so it kind of led you to this investigation. But yeah, I'll be, good to hear how you...
Well, since we did the interview in Japan, it seems fitting that I talk a little bit about the Japanese context in the 30s and 40s that Barry was alluding to. There was, of course, the very important 1937 pavilion at the Paris World's Fair by Sakakura Junzo, which would have been, of course, familiar to everybody at the GS, even at the MIT, in the late 30s. This 10-year trajectory between, let's say, 1943 to 1953 is really something that I think needs to be unpacked much more carefully. I know we have dissertations in the works on TAC and related material. But I mean, of course, Japan figures very prominently in the work, in, let's say, the worldview of people like Gropius and Breuer in the late 40s and early 50s. Gropius didn't really make it to Japan until 1954, but that was already very clearly in the imagination. He had students, a lot of students at the Bauhaus from Japan in the late 20s and early 30s. So he was very, very familiar with the scene. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, in fact, one of only two venues, I believe, where the Hwa Chong University project was published was in the Japanese journal in Kokusai Kenchiku. And that was, again, very closely referenced by Japanese colleagues in the early 50s when that became available. I think there are elements of, particularly the rendering, that remind me more of what architects were looking at in Japan in the 40s and early 50s than, let's say, contemporaries otherwise in China.
Sorry, do you mind if are you responding to the question about how you have come to approach your, or be interested in that subject matter between PEI's deployment of art in his spaces? But I'm just, is that or did I miss that?
No, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, it's one question that essentially has been I'm trying to unload from my chest for the last 10 years, so it's really a great opportunity for me to finally come to terms with a guy, working on Japan mostly. In the interim, I wouldn't have had the opportunity otherwise.
Okay. Then don't mind me asking one more question about the, so it seems, again, this is kind of a combination of an overall question, but also a little bit more about your topic, which is, the way he deploys art, like what you said, I think he was afraid that, the scale is immense and therefore I need something there. So does it mean that he only deploys art as a form of appendage to his space, or is there a real sort of just wanted to hear you say more about that.
I think certainly with certain artists, and it's never just the choice of the architect. It's hardly ever the choice of the architect to choose what kind of art goes into the building or goes outside the building. I think there are certain cases of, I think it's fair to say the Calder stabios, as opposed to the mobiles, and the Henry Moores tend to act in a more complementary manner to his architecture. But again, this is, I think the possibilities, the tantalizing possibilities of what the Giacometti offered and the Dubuffet offered, really had this potential for certain spatial design breakthroughs that the Moores and the Calders did not.
Thank you. So yes, we have 10 minutes left, so I think I should not ask my last question. To the floor. Anyone has first question?
I can take over. No, I was this morning, and I'm sorry I missed the morning discussion, so I hope I don't repeat some things. But it occurred to me that I think all three speakers this morning used the word modern and even search for a modern or a kind of approaching the modern, assuming we knew what the modern was. Even Juan had it intertidal. I think Chin Wei also used the phrase maybe approaching the modern or searching for the modern. And it occurred to me that what the modern meant in the early, I didn't know these early PEI things that Chin Wei was showing. They were all tectonic. It had to do with a kind of web of materials really literally woven together. I completely agree with Barry that the descriptions we tend to still use of that early work are coming as much from Gropius and the Bauhaus. Well, they're coming from the Bauhaus for sure. This kind of dialectic between craft and abstraction and technology, between sort of the materiality and the nature of materials versus perception. That all comes from the Bauhaus, and it's something like that I think we mean when we approach the modern then. But by the 60s, it's completely moved, the work is completely moved out of a tectonic mode and into a kind of prismatic, stereotomic cut. The volumes seem cut. And two other things keep recurring: the diagonal and the inverted L. And it began to occur to me, and it was actually the conversation I was having with Sang yesterday about the sculpture and the rejection of the Dubuffet, that the inverted L and the diagonals and the stereotomic nature completely changes how you relate to the works in terms of the corporeality, in terms of your own body. And to me, it almost, like Everson, I saw it so long ago that I don't even know if I would see it the same way now. But thinking about it now, it actually seems almost agonistic. It seems that there's an agon, a struggle between the human body and the corporeal architectural body, so that the whole notion of subjectivity and body and space is completely changing toward a more agonistic one, as opposed to this comforting, peaceful reconciliation that people talk about mostly when they talk about especially the early work. Anyway, and it seems to me that the Dubuffet, and I'm wondering about the Everson, is a way. It is actually the only of his favorite arts that has a similarly agonistic relationship. I mean, it's brutal. It's art brut, right? And it's taking, as you said, saying the dimension of the metropolis and the dimension of urban life post-war. And I think the other thing that I missed this morning and this afternoon, that nobody mentions that there was a world war in between his early life and his later work, that I think also has to have changed his relationship to China was completely changed with the Cultural Revolution, and his relationships with life had to be changed by the war. And I think that the Dubuffet gets at that somehow. And so I'm wondering, using the Dubuffet to defamiliarize what we think about Pei's work, if those inverted L's and if those incised volumes aren't much more, I don't know, we throw around words like radical and aggressive, but I actually mean agonistic in the theatrical sense, that there's a struggle than we used to think about Pei.
Maybe this is a tangent to what you just said, but one reason I was very eager to take the thesis project away from the history of museums is I think there's a complete rupture between that thesis project and the Everson Museum. I mean, they could not be more different. The thesis project is an open frame through which this landscape meanders, although you have to pay attention to section because much of it is actually is slightly sunken, so it's not as though you're walking through a garden. There are these framed landscape elements within it, but it is still a framework which also, and unfortunately we don't have a full range of views, and I haven't been to the archive at the GSD, so I don't know if there are more sheets for that project than what end up on the magazine spread, of views to the exterior. And so what is the relationship to this implied situation in Shanghai, but in any case, generically to the city. Whereas the Everson Museum can only be understood as and in that sense goes more into Eric's moment, it's not only post-war, it is in complete moment of urban renewal. And the Everson Museum is built on top of an underground parking lot so that suburbanites can come into this redevelopment zone and actually enter the museum without even coming off the plaza. So the plaza of the Everson Museum is a typical urban renewal scheme where there's a real ambiguity about the suburbanites who might come to a museum as opposed to the south side of Syracuse, which is in the process of being bulldozed.
I mean, all those projects are in that context, that they're all actually.
Then treat it like an ice cream cone.
Thank you. All those projects are part of that idea. I mean, that the idea is that the white middle class is in the suburbs, and they have to be lured back into the city to somehow experience art and culture. So it's it's a very different idea than we might have today about these kinds of institutions.
Maybe try to add more formal reading to Michael Hayes' take of the change of sensibility of either to cut the stone like stereotomy or tectonic frame. The approach you describe as Everson Museum away from Shanghai Museum, probably there's deep kind of a paradox when one deals with the framework, tectonic frame that connects, let's say, Chinese or Japanese timber construction like a framework, probably all the way to Mies van der Rohe's frame, dematerialized frame, dissolving into the air, versus this late, let's say, late modernist, this sculptural form, so massive, so solid, all about solid void, like a sculptural contrasting. And it seems to me that Pei was struggling between the two, especially when he deals with the Chinese project. That's why I mentioned this morning, if you take, let's say, the garden or timber frame as tradition to carry on, you would have the trouble of how to deal with sculptural form, because on the one hand, you have a big, gigantic program, modern program, like a hotel. You have to deal with the volume. Then he tries very hard to decompose them, either into fragments, but he also had to apply a lot of lines to kind of either decorate the surface or highlight the profile, the age lines. Right? This reminds me that when Corbusier visited Kazura Park, he was quite annoyed by like so many lines on the facade of the buildings. They're not appear to be sculptural. Right? I think that's kind of inherent form of difficulty when you deal with the Oriental tradition as tectonic system.
I wonder if we might use your fascination with sculpture to go even further with that, because I think what, yeah, whatever. Because I think what is interesting is the continuity of iconography, for one, and a certain group of figures. So there is a continuation of what I see as the Mies van der Rohe obsession with figurative sculpture in relationship to non-figurative architecture. And so you get that again for the most part. But you could also say at the same time as there is this shift from the frame, the tectonic frame, it's very ceremonial in the case of the thesis project, but from that tectonic frame to these enclosed volumes, cantilevered L's or whatever at Everson and beyond, the collaging of the same sculptural figures appears. So what I wanted to ask you was, I was very surprised that you didn't show the Everson elevation, which for many years you see the photograph of, I guess, the Madison Avenue studio, that huge, that elevation was kind of over the drafting room. The iconicity of that drawing itself for the PEI office, but that the building, that building is composed in part around a Henry Moore that Syracuse didn't own because it had a pathetic collection. And PEI wanted them to acquire that Moore. But there is sort of locked into the composition of the building, but the architecture is now radically different from any Miesian project that would have collaged in a figurative modernist work. So poorly expressed, that's my question. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so a couple months ago, I drove all the way by myself from Boston to Syracuse to just see it again, to reacquaint myself with this building. And when the Coffee Papers was originally done back in the spring, my intention, and Shirley and Eric and Cole might recall this, was in fact to deal with the natural combination of the Henry Moore trajectory would of course be buildings like the Everson or Des Moines or Bowdoin. This certainly is something, and also make a very nice eventual sort of return to the line growth in Suzhou. That was the image I started with. I essentially made the decision that perhaps the Dubuffet and Giacometti story would be more interesting because it offered a new possibility that perhaps was more elusive. The Henry Moore story would be much easier to tell.
One last question and then today.
Sorry, this maybe is more of a follow-up comment. Since Michael, you mentioned this issue of the use of the word modern. I was a little bit uncomfortable. You didn't stay for the conversation, which turned out to be a debate where that also came up. And I agree with you that in the four speakers this morning, the word modern or modernism, I think in each one was quite different. Mm-hmm. So I can't speak for the three other panels. For my sense, the reason why the title of A Tower for Modern China, I was quoting I.M. Pei in his op-ed in New York Times, that we are working with this particular government because we had hope for a more open and modern country. So in that modern, I'm talking about the project of modernism, not the lines, but the cost of the lines. Of that I felt that it had quite a good affinity was what I was trying to talk about, that it wasn't just about the physical building of architecture, is that I think from Gropius, from Mies, there's something that is inherited about the hope for modern design, whether in modern art, whether it's art, design, architecture, urbanism, to have a, I don't want to use the word democratic quality, but to have a civic quality. So that was the term I was using this morning to say that Pei has expressed more than once that his project of choice are civic buildings because he wanted everyday people to inhabit them and to be in it. So, so I agree that perhaps this term is very important to define. And I also made a pretty bold statement linking it to Pei's fascination was the Suzhou Gardens, because my interpretation is that he read in the Suzhou Gardens a certain modern sensibilities that he was familiar with, art, collage, literature, improvisational, all kind of informally laid out in this particular relationship between building, landscape, city, etc.
We actually have a 10-minute break scheduled, so if you guys want to do what you need to do, and we'll reconvene in 10, 15 minutes at 4:45, please.
This is now the end of our part of the campaign, so we just have the responsibility to.
I want to be part of it.
So we're gonna set up.
Yeah, I think that'll get everyone's attention. Just Mingwei. Mingwei. Okay. So thank you everyone for coming back and for being here for another very enlightening and revelatory series of sessions on this as part of this very ambitious Rethinking Pay effort. Now, for those of you who weren't here this morning, we started with a session that was called Visions of China, a name that was very quickly problematized. But even before that, Zhu Tao, the moderator, had sort of jokingly suggested that we should have called it Visions of China, Versions of China. And in many ways, we could have also called this entire Rethinking Pay Symposium Versions of Pay, because clearly there's not just one pay. The pay was not one thing to all people. In fact, he was probably different things to different people. And in fact, last night, our director, M+ director, Sahanya Raffel, announced our intention to mount a major pay retrospective, which I'm really happy she did, because that means that I can finally talk about it publicly also. And our sort of our ulterior motive with this symposium was to bring out these different and new scholarly perspectives that could help inform this exhibition. Partly out of an awareness that M+ is a museum that looks at the world, but it looks at the world from the vantage point of where we are here. Now, I think we can all agree that we have always lived in a world in which ideas, people, or versions of people have circulated, and as they have circulated, they have been adapted, adopted, rejected, read, misread, interpreted, reinterpreted, and sometimes misinterpreted. And personally, for me, it's the misinterpretations and misunderstandings that are actually sometimes more interesting. So for this roundtable, we are focusing on how pay was seen, received, read, misread, reread here in this part of the world. We have, and we're going to do it from a first-hand perspective. My background is in architecture, design history, and anthropology, and maybe this is the anthropologist sort of seeping out. But I'm really excited that we have these 5 great speakers who all had personal encounters with pay, being from different parts of this region: Hong Kong, Beijing, Singapore, Taiwan. I'm not going to read their bios because their bios are all in your booklet, but I'll just say a quick word about each of them. Young Ho Chang probably needs no introduction in the same way that Pei opened eyes and opened doors here in China for architecture. I think we can say Young Ho has done the same for the generations that have followed him, and so we're very happy to have him. In the process of doing the same is Nelson Chen, who I think most of us know as a noted architect, but also the director of the School of Architecture at Chinese U. We have Huang Mingwei, the founder and principal of studio-based architects in Taichung, who went to Donghai University, which was one of the topics this morning, and actually worked for Pei in the 90s. Liu Tai-Ker, who I think most of us know has had no small impact in the development of our cities here in this region as the head of the housing and later urban renewal authorities in Singapore. And then last but not least, Margie Yang, the chairman of the Skell Group, a general sort of overall dynamo whose family was instrumental in actually commissioning Pei to design Fragrant Hill, his first project in China. So without further ado, we'll start with Young Ho. We've asked them all to just show 2 to 4 slides, 5 minutes, just kind of talking about their first encounters with Pei, and then we'll focus on the discussion afterwards. So please welcome Young Ho. Did someone?
Right here. Okay, got it. Thank you. Since we only have 5 minutes each, I'm going to skip all the greetings. And this is the panel of storytelling. I hope I'm right. So I have to tell you when I met, or rather encountered, Mr. Pei. I met Mr. Pei through my father, and Zhang Kaiji, and he was an architect, and he and Pei, they were very good friends. So I was trying to think. I was doing fact checking with Sandy. I think in 1982 or 83, I went to their office on Madison Avenue in New York City. Somehow I remember Mr. Pei was out of the office, but I met with Sandy, and I met with Mr. Kellogg Wang, if you know who he is. Yeah, Kellogg. So anyway, and then in early 90s, I already back in Beijing practicing. And during a few years, when Mr. Pei was working on the Bank of China project in Beijing, the headquarters project in Beijing, and he visited Beijing often, and then I got to see him quite a bit. Usually it's a big family gathering. It's my family and my parents. Let me show a picture so you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay. So Mr. Pei, my mom, my father, and Mrs. Pei. So my partner, Li Jia, and from our side, and then on the Pei family side, sometimes Ding will be there, and then sometimes Didi and his wife and children, if I remember correctly, and Sandy, and also Mr. Pei's brother, YK, and his wife. Everyone calls her Auntie Mary. Could all be there for a big dinner, and we had quite a few of those dinners. However, beside the dinners, I remember having private conversations with Mr. Pei about architecture. I would ask some naive questions, and he gave me some very serious answers, actually, such as one day I remember I asked him if he already had an idea for Bank of China headquarters. And he said yes. So I asked him, could you share your idea with me? And he said, yes, I can. My idea is about a 50-meter span. So it was very mysterious to my ears. It turned out there were two 50-meter spans flanking the entrance at the street corner. So that's the way he was thinking about the design of the building, starting with the structure and starting with the most difficult part of the structural design and developing the atrium and the offices around it, rather than working from a concept from the exterior volume and so on. However, I really like to talk about a little more is another occasion. Somehow I was early in the hotel lobby where he stayed, and then he came down, just two of us, and we started a very casual conversation. I asked Mr. Pei what he did during the day. He said he went to the municipal office government of Beijing, and some officials asked him to make some suggestions about the urban development of the city. what I remembered at that point is what he said before. He made a very important observation about the city of Beijing before that particular occasion. He said Beijing was a horizontal city. And somehow the statement actually had to do, of course, with an understanding of city as architectural space. It had to do, of course, with the notion of fabric, hutongs and courtyard houses specifically. Also, there's the notion there is a spatial structure to some city at least, and Beijing was one. One spatial structure covers the entire city. And then, of course, bring back, cut back to the conversation we were having on that day. And he's basically saying that again, and he said at that time, this beautiful, unique, horizontal city was already destroyed. What could you do? And he made one suggestion to the officials. He said, well, at this time, all you can do, or you could do, is to just plant more trees to cover the architecture up. I don't think that part is ever probably published, but I think you can, if you check some of the archival materials, his description of Beijing as a horizontal city was in some Chinese newspapers when he first said it. So I think that's really very important, because if you look at this image, I don't know how familiar you are with Beijing. Beijing essentially is a horizontal city. There were very few monumental objects. I could count probably with one hand for sure. They are still the stupas, I think that's the word, in Beijing. One's on top of a hill in the Imperial Garden, and the other one is this one right here. So this is the white stupa temple, Baita, and that's Fuchengmen. And so this is, you go out that way, is at that time the western outskirts of Beijing. And so as you can tell, what's important for the everyday life in Beijing, of course, this is the fabric. These few monuments, they were important there in some ways, but they were not dominating the city by any means. So with that understanding, of course, Mr. Pei made the observation. And then, of course, he was very sad about the fact that kind of a quality was destroyed. So that brings to another thing. I just thought in Beijing, Liang Sicheng's observation about the monuments, in this case, the city wall and some of the old structures were very important, although it was not really being carried out. So a lot of these monuments were destroyed anyway. However, people do remember them. Somehow today, I would suggest only when you put what Mr. Liang said and what Mr. Pei said together, you come to a much complete understanding of a city. So the objects and the fabric. So I think today we're still destroying the fabric, although we're preserving the objects. That's just not gonna really work if we really truly want to preserve the urban culture of cities like Beijing. So I just wanted to emphasize that. So let's remember Beijing as a horizontal city, and let's remember how fabric and urban spatial structure are very, very, very essential and important for a city. Thank you.
I like that slide so much I'm reluctant to move it, but forgive me. Okay. So thank you for your kind invitation to participate in this symposium. It's a great honor to be associated in any form or fashion with IMPE. So accordingly, I've been reformulating or rethinking, if you will, the title of this symposium. Why does the career of IMPE require any rethinking in the first place? And for me, personally speaking, it's simply appreciating Pei, one of the leading architects of his or any generation. But it is a paradox that the work of IMPE can be so publicly celebrated, but under-theorized among our profession. In some part, it may be because we all take Pei for granted. He was too prolific and successful in all genres, from commercial buildings to cultural projects. An architect who would rather have his body of built work speak for itself rather than offer commentaries through espousing design theories in lectures or publications. Having said that, my first and only personal encounter with IMPE was at one of his rare public lectures over 40 years ago, when he spoke not at Harvard, but at his earlier alma mater, MIT. I ran into Sandy that day in the studios of Gunn Hall. We hopped a bus together down Massachusetts Avenue to the other side of Cambridge. After the lecture, Sandy went down to the podium to greet his father, and I had the good fortune to share a brief conversation. Actually, it was centered about the occasion that Pei met Le Corbusier. And I remember that conversation almost verbatim to this day. And my lasting memory was how he treated everyone just the same, was a university president or just a student like myself then. Another reason why we take IMPE for granted is that he made it look too easy. As much as he was a master form giver, he was equal parts master strategist, conceiving and synthesizing seemingly impossible sites and complex problems with singular design solutions that were daring and innovative and ultimately compelling and timeless. So his design for the East Building of the National Gallery, which you're so familiar with, it framed the years that I was a student, from 71 to 78. And it was very much in the public eye during its formative design, construction, completion. The site, an awkward, how do you do this? Trapezoid, which he bisected with two triangles, one for the museum, one for the study center, still maintaining axial symmetry with the original Pope building opposite, and successfully merging a contemporary architectural form and vocabulary and harmony with the classical traditional buildings and monuments on the National Mall. So when you see and experience this building, you cannot imagine any other alternative solution which is so right and compelling. Similarly, his bold design for the pyramid at the Louvre overcame widespread public opposition to become a widely beloved icon for both Parisians and visitors alike. Again, we appreciate the form, presence, and symbolism of the pyramid, but the success of the design is not its abstract geometry, no matter how elegant, but the resulting space, light, movement made possible by the audacity to excavate the central courtyard, Le Cour Napoleon, that revitalized the entire museum complex of the Louvre. So both audacity and artistry in equal measure. Finally, at Fragrant Hill Hotel, it's easy for us to forget that represented the first major architectural contribution to China at the advent of the opening of economic reform by Deng Xiaoping. That's still under 40 years ago. And that this commission came about because of Pei's refusal to design a series of high-rise hotels in close proximity to the Imperial Palace. So at Fragrant Hill, instead of sculptural abstraction or angular geometry, there's a series of linked low-rise wings amidst and surrounding landscape gardens. in terms of architectural form-making, PEI was striving for a contemporary architectural language that respected and extended the cultural tradition of China. So you see its continued lineage and relevance in the Suzhou Museum, on the right-hand side. Although this lesson and legacy may be somewhat less influential today among the current generation of designers amidst rapid urbanization, nevertheless, it was a strong influence on my own project for an early housing development in Suzhou 25 years ago, in collaboration with Jim Kinoshita for the late developer C.F. Tao. So this is my homage to PEI. Go back to PEI, since this is what we're talking about. There's a saying that the currentness or updateness of a student's education can be traced to when their professors were educated. So in that case, I'm afraid my architecture students at CUHK get more than their share of old school from me. Lots of references of Kahn, Saarinen, Maki, Sterling, and of course, PEI. And what I try to convey to them, which is exemplified by the works and career of I.M. PEI, is to design with less concern for what's first, but with a profound commitment to what lasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, it's been quite an intense day. 3 slides in 5 minutes. Are you kidding me? Don't worry, Eric. I don't have much to say, so I'll do it on time. Okay. My name is Mingwei Huang. I'm from Taiwan. I'm a practitioner, practicing architect in Taiwan. I work at PEI Coffey and Partners since 1994 to 1999. This is the project I worked on. It's not Fragrance Hill Hotel. It's called the China-Europe International Business School in Pudong, Shanghai. So actually, you can see from the picture, although Mr. PEI retired from the firm already at that time, but his approach to the Oriental architecture still heavily influenced the firm's approach. Okay, so for example, you can see the the traditional Chinese garden layout. There are multi-courtyards within it. The library being the major central pavilion floating on the reflection pool, and connecting with all the covered pathways. And this is the Fragrance Hill Hotel we have seen many times today. Actually, similar to the Fragrance Hill Hotel, you can see the use of material on that job shows the attempt to integrate Oriental crafts into modern architecture. Oops. I actually first encountered PEI's building in 1985 when I was the student of architecture in Tonghai University. You can see the Luz Chapel here. Actually, it opened my eyes to architecture. It's often used as the architecture lesson 101 to liberate the first year students' ideas of what a building should look like, because the Luz Chapel introduces a very different dialectical relationship between the roof and the wall and the structure and envelope. So our professor often says that, okay, you can see a building doesn't have to be, there's a roof, there's a wall, and it doesn't have to be differentiated between the structure and the envelope. So everything becomes one. This is the eye-opener. Oops, we're missing one page, huh? Start showing the picture. Well, Ow. Just refuse to come out. Mhm. Sorry. Okay. Oh, that's the one. Okay. Well, it's not showing. Actually, I was trying to show. Oh, well, okay. Well, that's okay. Okay, so 17 years later, okay, I just use these slides. Okay, this is my first project in Tonghai University. It's called the Humanity Building. It was my first project as a solo practitioner. Same as Mr. Pei has his own solo practice in Tonghai University, the Luz Chapel. And actually, my building here has two features that's paying a tribute to the Luz Chapel. One being the corner cut off. There's a 45-degree diagonal cut off of the building. So the inner courtyard, from every spot of the inner courtyard, can have the view of Luz Chapel. And the second feature is the horizontal skyline here, the roof line here. Actually, the altitude of the skyline here and the top of the chapel are at the same altitude. So I make this very horizontal, so it humbles the big volume of my projects. Also, it makes a very reticent background for the Luz Chapel. That's my tribute to my eye-openers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to give my version of who IMPE really is. Well, I'm now the chairman of the Moral Studio, and that is exactly 14 days old. And also, this Center for Livable City is a government agency dealing with the research and teaching of urban issues. Now, so that's where I met IMPE in 1965 after I finished at Yale. And in my ignorance, I just walked into his office without appointment. But fortunately, he happened to be there. So I went to see him. And after about 15 minutes of chatting, he said, okay, I can use you. Come in next month. I kind of hesitated a bit. He said, what's wrong? I said, because I have enough money to last me for 2 more weeks. So what can I do? Oh, well, no problem. Come, start work next week. And that's how we began the 4-year apprenticeship with IM. So today I want to just, in the next 5 minutes, talk about IM, the man, the architect, and the guru. And you might think that I'm a little bit impolite to call him IM rather than Mr. Pei, because in the IMPE's office, everybody called him IM. Probably until today is still the same. So that's the way we related to each other. I want to say that, so this is my story. That means a caring man, because, you know, of my story about this, my sort of fun, and then he just let me start as soon as I needed to, so that I wouldn't go hungry. And also a charming person. Actually, in the office, among ourselves, when we were in Pei's office, we actually sometimes debated whether he got his jobs more because of his charm or because of his professional ability. Obviously, the answer is the latter, but he's totally charming. He's a charming person. And, but I feel that I want to say that he's also professionally charming, because when I first joined PEI's office, I was struck by the fact that no matter what project he had to do, all the drawings must be drawn to the edge of the paper. In other words, he would never draw his project as an island in a piece of white paper. They always draw all the way to the edge of paper. And that was a very important lesson to me, because I feel that, in fact, nowadays I do see a lot of architecture projects or even planning projects covering maybe a few square kilometers. The drawing shows just the project as an island on a piece of white paper. You go to IMP's office, not a single piece of drawing does not go all the way to the edge of the paper. So he actually worked in context, and that means his building is not only beautiful by themselves, they also charm the surrounding area, charm the city. So that is not just a personality, it's also his architecture. And he's a polite person. It's similar to this charming, because I think there's an English saying, no man is an island, and no project is an island, and he actually practiced that. So, for example, John Hancock Building, it was handled basically by Harry Cobb, and but there was kind of quite a bit of struggle, because this building is a huge building next to the Trinity Church, and how do you create a huge building and not overshadowing the Trinity Church was a struggle. And therefore, one day he came up with the idea of putting one edge of the John Hancock Building slightly skew, so this building will not be staring down at Trinity Church. It will be kind of looking like this. That's how the shape was created. So you can see the length he went through to relate his buildings to the surrounding buildings was amazing. And of course, East Wing, you don't have to say it, because it's on a triangular side. So even if you looked at the East Wing from the other side of the triangle, you know that this building has something to do with triangle. And then Gateway is a building in Singapore. And okay, so this John Hancock Building, you see that. And this is East Wing. Gateway happens to be on the important arterial road in Singapore, facing towards the sea, towards the sea. So he's decided to create a pair of buildings like an important gateway in Singapore. So his buildings are always in context, always speaking to the surrounding environment. Now, I am the architect. Well, despite my short stay with him in IMP's office, I had the great fortune of seeing him maybe 5 or 6 times a year, and then one-to-one, he just called me in and just having a chat with me. So these are some of the key words that I remember. One is when he designed a building, he cared a lot about how people move through the buildings, the movement, and also not just one way. He sometimes just a walkway, sometimes a ramp, sometimes a staircase, but he cared about the movement of the people in the building. That's a very if you go to his buildings and think about it, this is one important characteristic of his building, and helps you enjoy his building. And he cared a lot about the elegance. So this one I don't need to say. His buildings are always very elegant. But what is worth saying is he gave a lot of emphasis on the word dignity. He said that despite the fact that he had many highly experienced architects in the office, actually there's one thing he felt that he had difficulty delegating totally, is how to fine-tune the buildings until the buildings look dignified. To me, a building is like to him, a building is like a human being. They have to look dignified, and this is where he claimed that he put a lot of effort to make his building look dignified, and also he cared a lot about the internal lighting of the buildings, which I don't need to say much. You walk through his architects, you see the interior lighting. It's always very, very charming, very happy. So these are some of the key words that shaped his building. But at the same time, I feel that I actually hesitated I couldn't decide what to, it's really, the word should be simple, because in his words, he said it's very important for an architect to design a building that looks simple but not simplistic. Because if a building is simple, it's boring. But if it's simple but not simplistic, it has a lot of, it stands a lot of scrutiny, a lot of enjoyment. So that is another, a Miho building is a very simple, well, you look at the shapes, very simple, but it keeps you kind of going, exploring the architecture. This is simplicity. And the Louvre, of course, you can see that, in fact, a lot of people angrily asked me when it was first finished, how can IMPE put such an incongruous building in the Louvre? And I never had a chance to talk to IM on this thing, but I gave them an answer. I said, well, if the square on the Louvre is like a woman's chest, the diamond, the pyramid is a diamond. Now, what's wrong with that? And they all immediately accept this argument. So if, I think, Sandy, forgive me. You have to tell your father, forgive me for saying that. Clarity, well, you can see that this building, which I had a good fortune of going through it. From the outside, it may look very, it's a simplified version of Muslim architecture, but still, by IMPE standard, it's quite complex. But when you walk through inside, in fact, before I walked in, I said, well, I don't know how I'm going to find my way inside. Totally no problem. There's total clarity as you move through the space. So these are some of, I would say, some of his important, and obviously it's ageless, and I don't have to say that after so many years, the Bank of China until today is as modern as it ever was. So then I was moved to the last, so these are some of the building, the last slides. I'm going to say that IM actually went to great length to deliver his vision. What struck me a lot is that when I first joined the office, the Everson Museum was just completed. And I learned that in order to get the pink color bush hammer result on the surface, he searched around northern part of USA and finally found the quarry, the stone hill with the pink color he wanted, and then started a quarry just for that project alone. And not only that, the Louvre Museum, the pyramid, many of you obviously know that, in order to make it look like a piece of crystal, he actually asked the glass maker to, because the modern glass has a bit of green tint inside. In this pyramid, it's totally clear. And on top of that, when I was working as a totally junior architect on John Hancock, in order to make the tower of John Hancock disappear so that it would not overpower the Trinity Church, he actually asked the Belgium asked a glass supplier to create a type of glass that reflects the true color of outside. In other words, what you see is the tree, the skies, the trees and so on. You don't see the building. He wants the building to disappear. That's the length he went through to create his architecture. And therefore, I feel that And this one, maybe I just want to add a little bit, because this morning was quite a bit of discussion about to what extent Suzhou Garden was important to him. Personally, my impression, may be wrong, but this is my impression, is that being an architect practicing in New York, basically he positioned himself as an international architect. Why was there so much Suzhou Garden motifs in the Fragrant Hills and in Suzhou and so on? It's because when he creates a piece of architecture inside China, he has to reflect the Chinese culture. But once outside, in other places, for example, the East Wing, he would then reflect the location of that site and also relate to the National Gallery nearby. So he's very much a context architect. And so locality is very important. First, he's a modern architect. Second is locality. But I would say that despite the fact that he's an international architect, despite the fact that his buildings are simple and very strong, I feel that there is a cultural element in it, because his buildings may be strong, but not bombastic. His buildings are strong but elegant at the same time. I think that must come from his personal upbringing. And I think there was some debate whether, he was too much a businessman when he did the design. Personally, I feel that combining business thinking with architecture is to serve architecture well, to serve the users well, serve the clients well. It's definitely something I appreciate, I respect. And also, as I mentioned, because to achieve his aesthetic goals, he will combine aesthetic and technology. In fact, I was quite surprised that when he was doing single buildings, he would engage traffic engineers to ask them how the cars would flow in without causing congestion. How would they flow into the car park? In other words, he went to great length in solving the problem to make sure people enjoy the use of the building in its total sense. And personally, this is just my personal view. After having worked with him and also after having followed his buildings subsequently, I feel that his use of geometry is like the grammar of a language. To my mind, that has influenced me. So it's my belief that geometry and proportion is the grammar of architecture. And if you look at Iron Pace buildings, these two things are actually a very important element in design. And also, architecture is an art of communication without words. You look at a lot bit, like, for example, just now I mentioned the John Hancock building. It's communicating to the viewers that I'm respecting the Trinity Church. It's communication without words. And this concept has influenced the way I approach architecture nowadays. So finally, I would say that I think I'm very happy that IM has a totally rich and rewarding and long life, and inspiration to all of us, inspiration to me. The only complaint I have is that earlier this year I had to pay for the most expensive dinner in my whole life by flying halfway across the world to New York City to join his 100th birthday celebration. Thank you.
I don't know why I'm here. I'm not an architect. So I try to figure out, what do I have? Have some reasons to be here. Well, I am from Suzhou. My family is from Suzhou. And I was born in Hong Kong. And I went to MIT and then Harvard. So I guess those are the common elements. I finished my presentation. Oh, by the way, also, another third thing is, I'm a relatively good drinker, and I.M. was a great drinker. Now, to fill my 5 minutes, I'm going to try and give you some a horror story that started in 1978. 77. So this was a MIT club. Event in Hong Kong. So I.M. is there, and Auntie Eileen. Oh, by the way, it's Uncle I.M., Auntie Eileen, and I'm the one in the sleeveless dress on the left. So, very young. And then my father had cancer, and he was going to retire. But 3 months after his retirement, over dinner, he was talking to some Chinese leaders about how China should not follow Russia's economic development model and should start from light industry, must respect balance of payment. So he said 2 industries. Tourism, because China has natural beauty and heritage. So you have an opportunity to invest a little bit just to connect some of these beautiful cities, and you can start with tourism, which can generate a lot of foreign exchange. And the other one is the textile or apparel industry, which at that time, you can generate $14 of foreign exchange for every dollar of investment. Sewing machines are very cheap. So then they said, okay, very good, Mr. Yang, put your money where your mouth is. And so my father said, oh, okay. So he started apparel company, which now I work for. And the other is YTT, which is a company that was going to build hotels in China. And my father is from Shanghai and went to St. John's. I.M. was in a class with my father's youngest brother, and they all obviously, that Shanghainese group, have kept in touch with each other. So he called his friend George Cho from Paul White Construction. And George found I.M. And that's when the nightmare for I.M. began. I was very fortunate because I was sent on a visit with I.M. to go to Suzhou and some other cities, finally in Beijing. Because some of the most scenic cities in China are around in the Yangtze Delta. So, of course, we went to Suzhou. And I didn't know how fortunate I was, but I think that short visit really opened my eyes to the wonder of architecture. And I was very struck by what Tiger was saying, that architecture is a form of communication. And to me, because I now run a company that is going through transformation, and I have, from my experience with I.M., I've spent quite a lot of effort in using design and architecture to send out messages. When we were in Suzhou, in those days, there was only one 6-story building. So we went up to the building, and I.M. took the city leaders and said, Suzhou is meant to be seen from the ground. If you look at Suzhou from this angle, it's like looking at a woman without makeup. This is not the way Suzhou is to be looked at. And he tried to convince the leaders to keep that. The surrounding, I mean, you have to respect the culture, the surrounding. And then we went to all the gardens, and he was the first one who ever mentioned cantilever to me. And I thought, wow, this is great. And he talked to me, the first time he talked to me about the integration of nature with architecture. And I think this goes back to in China that is such an important part of architecture. So when he later on talked to me about the Suzhou Museum, he says, the trees, that's the most important thing. I guess he called every week to check on 4 trees. Okay. So then we went to Beijing. This is many years, and Beijing, this was 1978. And we went to the Imperial Palace. One day we went to the Imperial Palace, and I.M. told me about the history of how it was built. The brick under, as we walked towards the middle part of the palace, he told me how the bricks under the ground were crisscrossed layers, so nobody can drill a tunnel through. And then the proportion of the imperial palace is such that by the time you come in front of the emperor, you really feel that you are at the center of the universe. So he said, if you have a high-rise building next to it, you will not feel that you are at the center of the whole universe. So he made a pitch to the leaders of the city of Beijing, especially to Li Ruihuan, who at that time was head of the construction bureau. Unfortunately, it was too early. So I did manage to convince them to keep what is in the line of sight from the imperial palace out, to keep the buildings within that height. I think up till now, he's still quite proud that he convinced them to keep that. Now, we had, in those days, our company was really a startup. It was a high risk, and there was not even the joint venture law. So what we were going to do was to use a compensatory trade format. Nobody's ever used that. What essentially it does is that you can't own the hotel. So everything you put in, you hope that you have an opportunity to sell hotel rooms and then get back the money. And we were going to build 3 hotels in Beijing. I.M. said, I am not going to build a high-rise in Beijing, not in the city. So now we had brought in Hyatt Group to run the hotels. So Wagi Hana had to design the 2 hotels in the city. I.M. He said I will build a hotel outside of the city. It will be we will not use any imported material. We will use what China is good at, and we will work around the avoiding imported elevators. This was before there was a joint venture elevator factory. So he said it will be only 3 stories high, so within walking, you can walk up. And this is all local material. And then he said, using the courtyard and garden, it's like Lego blocks. So you can expand it or shrink it. And he said, I give you the design. You can take it and you can use it in cities like Suzhou, Hangzhou, because this is very flexible, very modular, and very practical, and you don't have to spend foreign exchange. So going back to a business acumen, really, I.M. was very, very right on the, really got it. And when we went to Suzhou, it was the first time we met Cheng Congzhou. Cheng Congzhou is the garden expert. Later on, I.M. invited him to build the Suzhou Garden in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so going back to Fragrant Hill. Now, Bing gave me a copy, very cruelly reminded me of how little money there was in that contract. But that was only part of the nightmare. Because it's in Fragrant Hill, so this is a photo of some of the people who are working on it. You can see I am. The fat guy with the crew cut in the back is my dad. And the other people are a lot of really nice people, but dealing with a very tough. This is the first foreign venture hotel. And he picked, of all places, he liked the surrounding. He picked Fragrant Hill. Every one of those trees are protected. Every one of those trees are protected. You want to cut any tree down, it has to be approved by the state council. Anyway, we were very lucky. We had Li Ruihuan, who was a real, he was going to fight very hard to get things done. So we managed to get, by the way, this is now everyone's waiting and clock is ticking. And so finally we got all the trees approved for chopping. And then they started working and then realized that one branch of a tree from the outside of the white line was extending into the site. And they said, no, you cannot touch that branch because that tree is protected. You cannot touch it. You have to go all the way back to State Council. That's only one of the many nightmares. I think the person who probably would know more of the nightmares is Kellogg. I think Kellogg was on site a lot. Calvin worked on it, but I don't think Calvin was old enough to solve any of the problems. You were like me, you were just a punk kid. And so drinking was a very important skill. You had to really drink a lot. And I remember when there was only one bottle of single malt left, it was like passed from room to room. Dale and Pat Keller was there. He was also a very good drinker. And the guys from the first service bureau were amazing drinkers. So we had a lot of fun, but it was extremely painful, extremely painful. My cousin was in charge of housekeeping. She had to push water out of every bathtub because the bathtubs were installed the wrong angle. So the water, the side that's supposed to be tilted for the water to go out was put on the other side. And then of course, all the service staff was chosen from the senior leaders' children, right? This was going to be a tremendous opportunity, beautiful uniform, etc. And then they took one look at where they're supposed to go, and they all left with the uniform. So when IM came in October of 1982 with friends such as Jacqueline Onassis, they were in for a real shock. I was very clever. I had my daughter in mid-October, so I was in a hospital. My father hid in the hotel room, refused to go out. I went downstairs to carry bags up for Jacqueline Onassis and some of the other guests. Jacqueline Onassis was very impressive because she was extremely resourceful. She made toilet paper holders from the wire cloth hangers and went around to people's room knocking on the door and saying that, I think you'll need this, and gave toilet papers to the guest. And I was like going, oh, this is not possible, this is not happening. And my dad just hit the bottle the whole time. So my father played tennis with the Bank of China's head. Who's that gentleman wearing glasses, kneeling down? And my father, for several years, kept telling Mr. Jiang, it has been extremely unfair to IM. He did so much work. He gave you so much good advice. On top of just designing the hotel, so much free advice. And they lost a lot of money. We all lost a lot of money. In fact, for us as a startup, it was finished. That company just finished. And that's why around Fragrant Hill, you can see blood marks, stains of blood. And so when Mr. Jiang was going to build the Bank of China building, he gave the commission to IM. He said, definitely, we owe him. So that was through, my father was very happy when, these are all the tennis players. This photo, the relevance of this photo is that these are all the tennis buddies who played tennis and were big fans of IM and harassed Mr. Jiang and of course, Mr. Jiang is also from Shanghai and a great fan of IM. So that's how. And I think, Sandy, you can go back and tell your dad, yeah, YL was kind of a mafia. He went around harassing people. Nag. So I must say that, while I'm not an architect, I have really been very fortunate to have met Uncle IM at such an early age, where he impressed upon me the importance of design and how it integrates with. Ever since that encounter, I've realized how important it is, the messages that you send with buildings. So while I was at MIT, I hated it when we had to go around raising money for the Frank Gehry building, but I put up with it. I was council chair at Hong Kong Poly U when the Zaha Hadid building was being built. And that was a nightmare. But I appreciated it, and I felt that it was important that we rise to the challenge. And now, when my company has an opportunity in a place like Guiying, the first thing I resorted to was to use architecture to try to tell a story about a new phase of development, economic development for China. And you can invite me back another day when I can tell you that story. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Margie. That was amazing. I think all of us are kind of rewriting the story of Fragrant Hill in our minds as you were speaking. And also, thanks to all the speakers. This issue of pain and agony seems to be coming up a lot this afternoon. I don't know, Young Ho, when you're talking about PEI's sort of reflections on Beijing and his desire to sort of, or his reflecting on it being a horizontal city, it of course made me think of, and you mentioned Liang Sicheng and that famous quote, which I'm about to mangle right now, about when they tore the Beijing city walls down. It was like having his flesh and skin ripped off or something like that. I remember not long ago, you were quoted saying, when asked about what could be done to sort of solve some Beijing's urbanistic problems, I think you responded in a very melancholy way. I think we should just start over. And I'm in the context of PEI, I mean, how you alluded to this, but how important was his ability to convince the city not to build high-rises in the center, in kind of developing a greater consciousness, such as it is in Beijing, of maybe not preservation, but.
The story, I think Margie and someone else, maybe Mr. Liu mentioned, he was able to convince the city at least not to make high-rise buildings near the Forbidden City, which actually I didn't know that story. So what I heard, especially from him personally, really is his frustration. And actually, I remember hearing a story about what Margie said about the night before the opening of the Fragrant Hill. Didn't Mrs. Pei and Mr. Pei, they were mopping the floors and things. But anyway, coming back to the city, I sense that he tried because he had the opportunities to speak to very high-ranking government people and so on, but somehow his points were not really picked up. I just wanted to add one thing. I think this morning we were talking about, maybe in the afternoon, talking about Pei as a modern master or as a Chinese architect and so on. But I think it's also very easy to imagine Mr. Pei as a very sophisticated cosmopolitan people, meaning that he understands the value of culture. It doesn't matter where, if it's in Paris or in Beijing. So he really sensed that the Chinese culture from Suzhou to Beijing to other cities is something, it's very important, not only to Chinese people, but to the world. So that's the thing we really have to remember. So he's sort of if he's trying to save Beijing, he's doing that for humanity, not only for ourselves.
Well, go, please. Yes, please.
If you look at what he's trying to say, and if you look at what came out from the 19th Congress, you could put everything that Tiger talked about just now in his slides, and it's exactly what Xi Jinping is advocating. But it's 40 years after IM said it. Now, I even worry today, whereas in Beijing, Xi Jinping said that, how much will it really trickle down, given that all the local provincial leaders still are given the KPI of GDP growth. So, so everything that is in the 19th Congress is exactly what IM has talked about and respected all along, and it's really sad to see that somebody comes 40 years ago, say this, and then at that time, I remember exactly what happened. So Dale Keller designed so that all the air conditioning was hidden. They said, no, we want the air conditioning to show, the ducting to show, because we want to show that this is modern, we want to show the technology. And that was the mentality, and IM just really put up with it, and then he kept trying to find different ways of saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of sort of now and then, or then and now, I mean, one thing that would be great to get a better sense of is how, when Pei started working in China, how his work was received, used, misused, or influential. I mean, when Fragrant Hill was first completed, I think the People's Daily labeled it a very strange building, which, as Cole Roscom sort of alluded to in his faculty lecture last week, which maybe reminds us of the current sort of, or more recent, Chi Guai Guai moment that Xi Jinping had. I mean, what was the? I mean, could you, Margie, or maybe Young Ho, or any of our panelists, or any of the audience members, sort of speak to the effect that Fragrant Hill had on architectural discourse at such a formative period?
I can tell you two things. Initially, I think that it wasn't well received, for sure. One reason I could remember was that somehow some local architects would see the forms of the Fragrant Hill Hotel as being too southern. It looks something from the south of the Yangtze River, and so on, and as if Mr. Pei is doing a particular traditional style, which is wrong anyway. And then later on,
in essence, he was misinterpreting.
well, I think he was inventing, right? He's creating something that would be modern Chinese. So that's the whole thing, our Chinese modern, our Chinese contemporary. And then later on, something I just felt, I wanted to ask him, but somehow never, it wasn't a nice question, but I was very curious. His diamond-shaped window, it was so widely copied. You see it everywhere. It just really is like a virus. And then, it just from the kind of a really difficulty to accept, it became extremely popular amongst some of the local architects. I think, I don't know, either events was really easy to kind of to digest.
Or Ming Wei. Oh, sorry, Nelson, go ahead, please.
Just want to address this challenge of how do you express modernism while also not turning your back on your own culture. So you look at post-World War II Japan. There's a generation of very inappropriate Western-style buildings at the outset, or the Middle East during the 60s and 70s when Jack Robertson was working there, before you had the Aga Khan Award. And in China, again, China opened only 40 years ago. So, the first wave of architecture and construction, so much of it is so inappropriate. So I think it's in that context that Pei wanted to find what he called, quote, a third way, right? Modern but respecting your cultural roots. And so now we look at Japanese modern architecture, and even without knowing what city, what context, you look at the work, it's unmistakably, uncompromisingly modern, but unmistakably Japanese. Now, in China, we are sort of starting to see that emerging, but just the inklings of it.
I mean, it was interesting this morning, Liu Leafband kind of started to draw this sort of trajectory or line from Fragrant Hill to Suzhou Museum to Wangshu. I mean, is it maybe Ming Wei or Nelson? Do you well, Nelson, in your own work, your sort of your own project, I think it was in Suzhou. In Ming Wei, you as well were acknowledging Pei's influence, but maybe in the bigger picture, this whole sort of.
At least I recall in my experience, doing Suzhou style in Suzhou, at least I didn't get criticized for that. But in the public review process, there was a number of stakeholders who were able to talk about the project. I mean, the drainage services department or the electrical company all could stand up and say something about the design. I recall it's about this size an audience, 50, 60 people. And at the end of that long meeting, which was about 3 or 4 hours, it was almost evenly divided between people who said it wasn't traditional enough, you weren't respecting the details and the proportions, and the other half who said, well, it's really, you're trying to do Suzhou style, but it's too modern. And my conclusion was, I think we've got it just about right. And in the end, we were able to get that approval and proceed. But it's a very sensitive balance.
Did you want to say something?
Well, for my project and my experience, actually, it's easier because the Luz Chapel, right? Luz Chapel looks very Chinese to me, but it doesn't have any Chinese language on the windows or the structure. It doesn't have anything like that. So when I started my first project, the humanity buildings, we studied all the courtyards in the Tonghai University, the size and the scale and the proportion of the courtyards. We started from making viable courtyards and open spaces in the school. But we didn't pay much attention to the language and all the things like that. And the other thing I have to say is that actually the huge pressure doesn't come from the language or the form or how it looks, right? The building of my project is about 15,000 square meters, and the construction fee is way below $500 US per square meter. So it's a cheap dirt building, right? Very cheap building, but we have to achieve that and to increase the floor area of the usable floor area of the school. That's one major challenge. So I think in the end, the open spaces have a kind of quality of the, reminds people of the old courtyards buildings within the campus. And we do have the cut-off corner to pay the tribute to the Luz Chapel. So that actually kind of satisfied most of the people's expectations of that building. So that's my answer to that.
I do have a question for Tai Kerr, but I realize we're running over. I mean, maybe we can just take a couple of questions from the audience before we, while you're all still here, while we still have an audience. Yes, Nazreen.
Could I just suggest that we don't only look at modernism as a style, first of all, and maybe as a cause? And in that case, then PEI is a true modern, because you said that he used the total surface of the paper. He never allowed any building to float or any projects to float. Therefore, he used the whole site. If he used the whole site, I would suggest that he made his buildings to become the site. If then they became the site, he had to make movement as a priority. And when he made movement as a priority, he had to deal with time in his buildings. And his buildings also became the city. So he was a true modern. And by that, I mean that he actually made the site not to be something that he had to challenge with, that he had to work with, that it was difficult, that it was easy, but the site was a given which he completely occupied. And we can see it in most of the buildings. So I don't know where I'm going in terms of the question, but I would probably say that the only place that he floated something was at the Louvre. Because the site is not a given, it is already a culture. And where he actually worked perhaps with the site in a very different way was at the Louvre in order to allow the site to become what Mitterrand was extremely proud of, and that was Egypt. Therefore, through the occupation of the site, he actually allowed himself to win the competition because he knew very well his client. His client was François Mitterrand, who had already started very early on to go to Egypt every year because he wanted to renew with the basis of the Western culture. So I would suggest that PEI knew just too well what he was doing. And if there hasn't been much written about it, is perhaps that he wants to keep this a little bit to himself, just like all the moderns did. So I really don't have a question.
PEI is no longer under-theorized. Well, I mean, maybe should we just? I'd like to give Tai Kerr like maybe the last word then. I mean,
well, first of all, I want to maybe make my statement clearer. You see, when you work on a site, the site will have irregular boundaries, and way too often I see an architect's plan just drawing the design within the site, and the rest will be just empty. But IMPE will not do that. He will draw the surrounding roads, surrounding buildings, sometimes even cast shadows, so that this site is in the context of the urban fabric. So his buildings are never islands.
So I mean, earlier this afternoon, Eric Mumford made a very big statement, which was that through his research, he had sort of come to see PEI as a more seminal figure in post-war urbanism. And Tai Kerr, I mean, you, having had such a huge influence on urbanism in this part of the world, especially Singapore, but elsewhere as well, I mean, are these ideas of PEI's that you found translating into what you subsequently did?
Are there ideas?
Yeah.
Certainly, that has a big influence on me.
In what sense?
Yeah, in the sense that, you see, one of the problems of modern cities today is that all the buildings clash with each other. They don't speak to each other, even though they are in the same rooms. But you cannot find a single IMPE's building that doesn't speak to all their neighbors. Now, in my view, this is the beginning of good urban design, because you look at the historical buildings, they all speak to each other nicely. But modern cities don't do that. And maybe this is also one opportunity for me to say that, first of all, I'm grateful for having learned this concept from IM, but at the same time, it has affected my job as an architect as well as a planner, because way too often you see a planner planning a site, maybe 5 square kilometers, and yet all the surrounding is just a piece of empty paper. You have no idea how this site fits into the city. But if you look at all my drawings, first of all, the north point must be exactly north and not slightly at an angle, because the whole idea of having a north point is for you to judge the sun angles. And second, all the, whatever site I work on, all the roads and surrounding buildings will be drawn to the edge of the drawing. And I emphasize this partly to express my gratitude to IM, but at the same time, I want to say that while we recognize IM as an architect, actually he's a very important urbanist as well.
Great. Well, on that note, we are about 15 minutes over, which is not too bad, actually.
Can I say something?
Okay, so I spoke too soon.
Actually, my wife and partner Li Jia reminded me yesterday. I should really let the students know one aspect of Mr. PEI, but I forgot. Hopefully, this is not too late. Well, we talked about PEI's work in China, but actually, Mr. PEI cares very much about the development of Chinese architecture, not only his buildings. He, in the early 80s, and he established a fellowship to bring Chinese architects to the United States. However, only under the condition that person would return to China. You remember that nonsense. I was the first person. He didn't know many Chinese architects in the States at that time. He called me up and asked me, "Are you thinking of returning to China? I said, no. Well, and he said, well, you're out. I can't give you. Well, he said, well, in that case, I'll give it to your father. So my father became the first person who received the traveling fellowship. Yeah. But it didn't sound very serious, but he was very serious. And then later on, I don't remember, probably in late 80s, I still remember he discovered someone, a young architect from China who received a PhD in Sweden, who happened to be a classmate of mine in Nanjing, and he's very bright, my classmate, and Mr. Pei really liked him very, very much. He was about his name is Zhao Xuedong. He was about to leave. He's on a tourist visa. He was about to leave New York to go back to Sweden the next day. However, Mr. Pei said, don't go, I'll figure out a way to extend your visa. Somehow he did. And that person stayed in his office. And then later on, when Mr. Pei organized, I don't think he did many, we can do a fact-checking always, Sandy. He did a symposium. Maybe that was the only one in Nice, in France, about contemporary Chinese architecture. And then he invited Zhao to go along and so on. And I think that story is something that we have to also keep in mind. Today I don't even know what happens to that traveling scholarship. Is it still going or not? But actually, that's one aspect of Mr. Pei. We don't really hear much, so I just wanted to share that.
Well, on that note, we have to thank all of our panelists. Well, actually, all of our speakers today. It's been a really great day, following up on 2 previous really great days in Boston, and I think we can look forward to another one tomorrow, starting at 10. I just want to personally thank Nazreen, Cole, and Ivan again, as well as our collaborators at GSD. Again, Margie, Taiker, Mingwei, Nelson, and Young Ho. That was really, I wish we could sort of go on and on. But thanks to all of you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow morning, again at 10 o'clock. Thank you.